Chapter 2055. With my own ability, it's difficult for me to break this barrier that has been built for billions of years. I need to rely on external forces. All sorts of thoughts eventually converged into such a conclusion. With this conclusion, it was naturally easy to do what needed to be done. For him now, the greatest and strongest external force was not the half-step primordial origin spiritual treasure, but the eternal world, which had been connected to the second level of the Tao Master's Road and had become an extremely important part of it. This indestructible heaven and earth was extremely profound. It possessed boundless might and endless principles. If he could mobilize it, it would be equivalent to mobilizing a part of the Tao Sovereign's path. At that time, it would be a simple matter to break any barrier built on the Tao Sovereign's path. With such a thought in mind, he no longer hesitated and began to recall his senses, carefully sensing the eternal world. If he wanted to mobilize the eternal world, he naturally needed to have a deep understanding of it. It was like an ordinary person who did not even know how to use a computer. How was it possible for him to hack into a bank to change his savings? Now, for Luo Fan, using this indestructible world to break through that incomparably solid barrier was equivalent to an ordinary person trying to hack into the bank system to change their savings. Fortunately, the eternal world was ultimately born because of his concept of immortality. The countless worlds within it were worlds that had completely integrated with all the concepts contained in his worldview. Therefore, even though the eternal world had undergone earth-shattering changes compared to before, its foundation was still extremely closely linked to him, and there were still parts that he was extremely familiar with. Under such circumstances, he wanted to familiarize himself with the eternal world and achieve complete control over it. In the end, it was not a difficult task to mobilize all of its power. As Luo Fan continued to understand the eternal world, time gradually passed. For the cultivators on the second level of the Tao Sovereign's path, the appearance of the eternal world represented a brand new opportunity. A brand new opportunity. Such an opportunity was hard to come by since ancient times. Combined with the legends that have been passed down through the ages, there were even many cultivators who suspected that the eternal world represented the hope of surpassing the Tao Sovereign's path. Because of this, after the eternal world completely stabilized and the light completely disappeared, a large number of cultivators from the second level of the Tao Sovereign's path began to enter the eternal world. They entered the worlds within to search for treasures and to comprehend the mysteries that were likely to surpass the Tao Sovereign's path. In just a short 100 years, the number of cultivators in the eternal world exceeded 1 billion. This was already more than the number of cultivators in any of the other abnormal landscapes. After the 1 billion cultivators entered the eternal world, they were shocked by the endless concepts revealed by it. Perhaps they had all sorts of thoughts at first, but after truly understanding the world, they couldn't help but be convinced. In the end, they gradually immersed themselves into the concepts, or, to say, their senses were incomparably profound. They began to comprehend the mysterious power that surpassed any ordinary power. Their actions strengthened the eternal world from another aspect, strengthening the countless worlds within it, causing the operation of the eternal world to become even more complicated. The evolution of the various mysterious mechanisms within it became even more exquisite. From time to time, there would be a cultivator who obtained a rare treasure in a certain world and left with great satisfaction. From time to time, there would be cultivators who comprehended a wondrous path of cultivation in a certain world and made great progress in their cultivation. From time to time, there would be cultivators who spread rumors of treasures being unearthed in a certain void, and so on and so forth. Although the eternal world had only just appeared, it was much livelier than any of the other phenomena that had appeared before. Moreover, the opportunities within it were clearly much more numerous than the other landscapes. With such a background, the cultivators in the eternal world. Naturally, the number of cultivators kept increasing. In the end, after 10,000 years, when Luo Fan finally completely familiarized himself with the eternal world and even improved his understanding of the world through this familiarity, Even the descent of the fifth great calamity seemed to have become much clearer. The number of cultivators in the eternal world had already exceeded 10 billion. On this day, Luo Fan returned to his senses, and an inexplicable smile appeared on his face. I just happened to need your strength. With this smile, his mind moved. In an instant, the entire eternal world began to tremble. The tremors were extremely weak at first. In fact, if Luo Fan wasn't the cause of the tremors, he wouldn't have been able to sense their existence at all. However, as time passed, the tremors continued to grow stronger. Soon, they became so strong that even ordinary people could sense them. Due to the tremors, the countless worlds in the eternal world began to tremble as well. As they trembled, every world began to respond to each other. The resonance between them grew stronger and stronger, and an inexplicable connection was gradually established during this process. As this connection deepened, the countless worlds in the entire world were gradually strung together. The power of every world began to communicate and flow with each other, gradually forming an indescribable force. At this moment, no matter where they were in the eternal world, whether it was in the void or in the various worlds, they could faintly feel an indescribable power pressing down on them. It was also stringing them together with all the other cultivators, all the worlds, and even the eternal world. Under normal circumstances, if they suddenly felt like they were connected to some other cultivators, those cultivators would naturally struggle with all their might. They would feel like someone was playing a trick on them, trying to seize their power and make use of it. However, at this moment, it wasn't just cultivators that were being strung together with them. It was countless worlds. Instead, it was the eternal world itself that they had entered. Under such circumstances, those cultivators would only feel that this was some sort of special change to the eternal world. In fact, they would think that this was some sort of special opportunity that might exist in the eternal world. Because of this, they naturally couldn't struggle. On the contrary, they began to look forward to what was going to happen next. Could it be that the number of people has reached a certain level and a deeper world is about to be opened? Could it be that someone has triggered something and is about to open some sort of test or inheritance? Could it be that the treasure that transcends the Tao Master level is about to appear? These various thoughts caused the over 10 billion cultivators to become slightly excited. Their eyes were filled with indescribable anticipation. They're actually so cooperative. Luo Fan could even completely control the eternal world, so he was naturally very clear about the reactions of the many cultivators. At this moment, this was the only thought that flashed through his mind. Then, he no longer hesitated. He directly roused the power of the entire eternal world, the countless worlds within it, and the over 10 billion cultivators on the second level of the Tao Master Path. He followed the reaction of the eternal world itself and blasted it towards the barrier that completely sealed off this area. At this moment, countless screams rang out from various parts of the void within the eternal world. There weren't many of these screams that were tragic. Instead, they were mostly astonished. This situation was caused by the eternal world performance being different from what they had expected. This part of the world's absorption of their power was simply too strong. It was so strong that they couldn't even effectively respond to it. All they could do was slightly waver, and all their power had been sucked dry. This kind of absorption was simply beyond the scope of their understanding. How could they not be astonished? Crack, 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 crack. Incomparably terrifying thunderclaps reverberated from the void where the eternal heaven and earth was located. Under this sound, circles upon circles of ripples began to spread out from the eternal world in all directions. It looked like waves upon waves were constantly surging outwards. Although the barrier had sealed off a large area, it didn't mean that it had surrounded the large area with a large number of unusual sights in all directions. In reality, this confinement was a confinement on a higher level, not a confinement on a spatial level. Therefore, that barrier was actually on a space-time level. It existed at the same time as any natural landscape. In other words, any unusual sight. In fact, no matter where it was, it would coincide with the barrier. As long as one could sense the existence of the barrier, as long as one could touch it, one could naturally start attacking it from anywhere. It was just like how the eternal world was attacking the barrier at this moment. It was attacking the barrier behind the eternal world from where it was. Crack, 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 crack. Criss-cracking sounds constantly came from above and below the eternal world. Cracks appeared on the eternal world, as well as in the surrounding void. Furthermore, no matter where they were constantly becoming denser, larger, and spreading at the same time. The numerous cultivators within the eternal world were suffering from the pain of having their bones scraped and their marrow extracted. It felt as if countless sharp blades were slicing at every part of their bodies at every moment, and it even penetrated deep into their hearts and into their very essence. At this point, how could they not know that something was wrong with the situation? But what could they do even if they knew that something was wrong? At this moment, all of their power and might were being continuously extracted. Under such circumstances, any effort they made to escape from this situation would only become resources for the extraction of power, and they would be instantly extracted by the extraction of power. Under such circumstances, unless they triggered the preparations they had made in the outside world and attracted the power of the Tao Sovereign's prison, there was no way they could escape. What was even more difficult was that although the energy being extracted was so absolute that they couldn't resist it at all, but it accurately grasped the limits of what they could bear, causing them to lose all of their strength. All of their power was being extracted, but their lives weren't harmed. This made it impossible for the cultivators to make up their minds to guide the power of the Tao Sovereign's prison to escape. After all, being thrown into the Tao Sovereign's prison meant that they would be imprisoned until the very last moment. Not many people could risk it. Those cultivators had endured such intense pain. Luo Fan, who was controlling everything from the center of the world and guiding everything, was under even greater pressure. At this moment, the layer of the world of laws covering her body fluctuated violently. Every bright spot in it was like a source of fluctuations, constantly emitting circles of fluctuations that constantly spread towards the entire worldview of laws. Countless densely packed fluctuations were constantly being generated and spreading. In the end, his figure looked extremely strange, as if he was completely formed by the endless fluctuations. His current world of laws was even able to support himself in a chaotic state for a short period of time. For him to be reduced to such a state under such circumstances, one could imagine how great the pressure he was under was. At this moment, his eyes widened and revealed an extremely strong determination. He let out a soft cry. Open! Following his cry, the aura on his body skyrocketed. In the blink of an eye, the cultivators in this part of the eternal heaven and earth knew for the first time. There was actually such an unbelievably powerful cultivator hidden in the eternal heaven and earth. In fact, it was also the first time they realized that a cultivator could be so unbelievably powerful. Is there really a conspiracy? At this moment, countless cultivators had the same thought. Following this thought, many cultivators didn't dare to stay any longer and tried to activate their bodies to guide the power of the Tao Sovereign's prison. But they didn't expect that they were still too slow. The power of the Tao Sovereign's prison descended at an unimaginable speed. Furthermore, no power or barrier could truly stop it. However, it still took time for these cultivators to carry out their thoughts. Therefore, when the power of the Tao Sovereign's prison descended, the void, it had already been broken. Or rather, it was a barrier that had imprisoned an unknown number of anomalies. It had already been broken. Behind the shattered void was a scene that they had never seen before. It was reflected in their senses, causing them to feel extremely regretful. They wished that they could turn back time so that they wouldn't have attracted the power of the Tao Sovereign's prison so quickly. At this moment, hundreds of millions of cultivators were directly captured by the power of the Tao Sovereign's prison and disappeared from the eternal heaven and earth. At this moment, outside the eternal heaven and earth was a vast and mysterious place that was filled with multicolored light. Apart from the multicolored light, this place looked quite similar to the area they were previously in. There were also unusual scenes scattered across the void like stars. There were also indescribably exquisite auras constantly being transmitted into their senses from all directions. However, the only difference was that this place was hundreds of millions of times larger than the area they were previously in. In the area they were previously in, there were only hundreds of unusual scenes. Although there were countless stars in the other areas, they were merely worlds or existences similar to worlds. But here, in the area they had just entered with the help of the eternal heaven and earth, there were countless stars and countless unusual scenes. There were no worlds or existences similar to worlds. How could this be? The cultivators who had yet to leave were already stunned. Why can I see so clearly? I'm clearly in the eternal heaven and earth right now. My senses should be obscured by the mist that fills the interior of the world, and I shouldn't be able to see beyond the world. Why can I see everything clearly now and even identify the essence of each star? Another cultivator discovered this huge doubt. At this moment, the existence that was constantly robbing them of their strength, robbing them of their might, and connecting them to the countless heavens and earth suddenly disappeared. As the draining power disappeared, all the cultivators, even the weakest among them, completely recovered within a breath's time as if they had not been drained at all. Every cultivator on the second level of the Tao Sovereign's path was an existence that far surpassed a supreme emperor. Such an existence could recover its own strength as easily as breathing in and out. Without this restraint, the over 10 billion cultivators were somewhat at a loss as to what to do. As the first cultivator began to step out of the eternal heaven and earth, more and more cultivators gradually began to step out. When they stepped out of the world, cries of surprise came from their mouths. What a dense power! Why is it that this is clearly the second level? But why is there such a dense power? The power they were talking about was naturally not ordinary power, but the concept that they regarded as mysterious power. Chapter 2057. Congratulations on breaking free from your shackles. At this moment, a grand voice reverberated through the void, shaking the light that covered the sky. It caused the light to constantly change, condensing into countless strange forms. It looked like an endless amount of heavenly flowers, an endless amount of strange scenery. The voice contained all kinds of indescribable charm. All the cultivators who heard the voice could clearly feel that all the mysterious power they could touch and feel was stirred by the voice. Under this feeling, an indescribable sense of inferiority spontaneously arose. In a trance, they felt as if they had turned into mortals and were facing an immortal that was neither dead nor alive. Following this change, an overwhelming number of silhouettes appeared in the void. Every single silhouette seemed to be no smaller than the phenomenon. Floating in the void, they looked like mortals looking down at ants in a cave. Over 10 billion cultivators actually broke free from their shackles and stepped into reality. This time, it is really a huge surprise. Another voice joined in. This voice also shook the mysterious energy that many cultivators sensed. In other words, it was the thoughts that filled the void. This strange scene has never appeared before. It seemed like they had relied on the opportunity of this phenomenon to break free from their shackles. It is a pity that they didn't break free on their own like I did back then. Suddenly, another voice joined in. Compared to the previous two voices, this new voice was much weaker. At the very least, it was not as many and powerful as the previous two voices. Although it still felt unstoppable, at least it was not as hopeless as the previous two voices. It could be said that if these 10 billion cultivators were to fight, they might immediately surrender when they encountered the previous two voices. However, when they encountered the owner of the last voice, they were still able to gather a bit of will to resist. They were able to erupt with even more power to attack him. At this moment, the light continued to condense and compress. Soon, it was compressed to the size of a normal person. It turned into several dozen figures and appeared before everyone. "Are you still unwilling to appear?" One of the men suddenly said indifferently. His eyes were like sharp swords, piercing through the barriers of the void and even the barriers of the eternal heaven and earth. looking into the eternal heaven and earth. In the center was a misty, special place. Although he couldn't see clearly what was inside, he could sense that there was a powerful existence that far surpassed the tens of billions of cultivators here. That kind of powerful existence. There was even an indescribably close connection between it and the phenomenon that had just appeared. It was even to the extent that he suspected that the reason this scene was able to escape its shackles and enter this area was because of that existence. At this moment, Luo Fan's figure materialized in front of them out of thin air. This method of condensing an avatar is really amazing. He muttered after condensing it. There was a look of realization on his face, as well as an indescribable joy. The Luo Fan that appeared here was not his real body. It wasn't an ordinary clone or projection either. Instead, it was a kind of avatar that was condensed with the help of concepts. This kind of avatar was completely condensed from the endless concepts that permeated the void. Everything that made up this avatar was the corresponding concepts. Because of such an existence, not only did this incarnation possess unimaginable power, it wasn't much weaker than his main body. Moreover, it possessed an almost indestructible and unbreakable nature. After all, the concepts that made up this avatar were the endless concepts that existed in the void. Because of this existence's foundation, any power that wanted to harm this avatar would be transmitted to the surrounding void and to the endless concepts around it. In this way, as long as that existence couldn't completely destroy this entire area and the surrounding void, it wouldn't be able to truly harm this incarnation. It wouldn't be able to destroy this incarnation. This could already be said to be an incarnation of indestructibility. How is this possible? The expressions of the cultivators that had just condensed changed drastically. They didn't expect that the person in front of them could deduce this avatar technique just by looking at their avatars. It must be known that it took them billions of years to cultivate such an incarnation. Which Tao Master's disciple are you? The cultivator asked directly. As far as he knew, only a Tao Master's disciple could do such an incredible thing. It seems that my guess is correct. This place is indeed occupied by a Tao Master's disciple. If I'm not mistaken, every one of these unusual scenes has been refined by you. Now, there are only a few of these unusual scenes that are unoccupied, right? Luo Fan said thoughtfully. The expressions of the 10 billion cultivators changed drastically when they heard this, and their gazes towards these cultivators were filled with shock, fear, jealousy, and indescribable hatred. In the Tao Master's great universe, being a disciple of a Tao Master was the highest status apart from being a Tao Master. It could be said that although being a Tao Master's disciple was in the same universe as them, in reality, they were on a completely different level compared to ordinary cultivators, be it rogue cultivators or disciples of ordinary sections. It could be said that there was no connection between them at all. In this way, to them, being a Tao Master's disciple was an extremely mysterious realm, and mystery gave rise to reverence. Therefore, in the eyes of other cultivators, being a Tao Master's disciple was an indescribably terrifying creature. Anything related to a Tao Master's disciple was a symbol of power. For example, magic treasures refined by a Tao Master's disciple, elixirs refined by a Tao Master's disciple, or formations set up by a Tao Master's disciple, in their eyes, represented the most powerful treasures under such circumstances. When they suddenly heard that these people in front of them were a Tao Master's disciple, the reverence in their hearts was self-evident. Then, they heard that these Tao Master's disciples had imprisoned them in a small place. On the other hand, they had occupied an area that was billions of times larger than where they were originally. They had even taken over the scenery that was originally shared by tens of billions of cultivators as their own. The jealousy, the anger, and the hatred were all self-evident. At this moment, one figure after another appeared around them. Waves of unparalleled powerful auras began to fill the void. The surrounding time and space seemed to freeze, and all the cultivators here felt as if their bodies were being imprisoned by these auras, as if they were no longer in control of themselves. You're not a Down Master's disciple, but you know so much. You're qualified to join us. A cultivator that looked like an old man said. This old man had a sage-like demeanor, and his entire body lingered with the charm of an otherworldly master. The aura emitted from his body was powerful enough to distort time and space, causing countless worlds to be born and destroyed around him at all times. In fact, such a powerful aura, it existed on the bodies of more and more cultivators around them. Each cultivator seemed to be surrounded by a group of worlds, with light and shadow constantly twisting and changing. It made them look incomparably tall and majestic. Not interested. I came to the Tao Master's path to cultivate, not to become one of you, Luo Fan said faintly. At this time, his gaze did not fall on these cultivators, but on the unusual scenes that existed in the void. His eyesight was activated, and he tried his best to see through the barriers of the unusual scenes. He looked at the one who had refined the anomaly landscape within the anomaly landscape. As he looked, he was a little disappointed, but he also felt inexplicably excited. Among the many phenomena, only an extremely small portion of them had been completely refined. Apart from this small portion, most of the other phenomena were just a small portion that had been refined. In fact, among the incarnations of so many cultivators, only an extremely small part of the corresponding unusual scene had been refined. In other words, from the perspective of cultivation, these cultivators were only at the bottom of the hierarchy among the many Tao Masters. None of the cultivators who had completely refined the unusual scene had appeared here. As for how Luo Fan was able to determine which of those strange scenes corresponded to which cultivator here, it was needless to say. These cultivators were now releasing their auras without any concealment. If he still couldn't grasp the characteristics of those auras, then he could only commit suicide. Grasping the characteristics of the auras, and then using those characteristics to find the corresponding unusual scene was a simple matter. Joining us is the greatest cultivation. Don't you know that, fellow Taoist? The old man didn't know that Luo Fan had already seen through them at this time. At this time, he still smiled and said. Hearing this, Luo Fan just shook his head indifferently. With a thought, the eternal world suddenly trembled and released an indescribable wave that swept in all directions. In the blink of an eye, the incarnations condensed from many thoughts shook and completely collapsed. All the figures disappeared without a trace in the blink of an eye, as if they had never been there. As for the original terrifying auras that they released, the heaven and earth that were born because of those auras also disappeared without a trace with them. How is this possible? How can you completely refine the unusual scene when you just entered here? At this moment, such an exclamation came from extremely far away. In the midst of this exclamation, figures emerged from extremely far away and looked with indescribable shock at Luo Fan, who was still standing quietly at this time. Sure enough, this method can drive them away. Luo Fan murmured. Suddenly, a cultivator came up, bowed, and asked, This, Senior, may we know what exactly is going on? Hearing this, Luo Fan just said indifferently, I borrowed your power to break the shackles, but I also help you break the shackles together, so we're even. What you want to know, you can find out for yourselves. I have no obligation to tell you. Hearing this, that cultivator's expression changed slightly. This sentence was indeed reasonable, but it was only reasonable. After all, there was such a thing as human relations between cultivators. Normally, when faced with an existence like him asking for advice, any cultivator would at least be a bit tactful, even if they were unwilling to answer. Who would be like this cultivator in front of him who did not care about human relations at all? This cultivator was ashamed and angry, and was about to say something. Suddenly, his heart shook. Maybe there is. That is, in his eyes, we are simply too inferior. Even describing us as ants is probably giving us too much credit. Only if this is the case would he act like this. Thinking of this, he broke out in cold sweat. If that was really the case, if he continued to bare his teeth, what awaited him might be an impatient slap from the other party. It was also directly smashed into pieces with a crack sound. At this time, Luo Fan no longer cared about this cultivator. With a thought, his consciousness incarnation began to frantically devour the endless multicolored light around him. In other words, that endless consciousness. As he devoured this endless consciousness, his incarnation began to gradually expand. In an extremely short time, it had grown from the size of a normal person to the size of the abnormal scene. In this state, he was even much larger than the cultivators that appeared here before. Even the incarnation of this consciousness incarnation was much more solid than the huge figures that they revealed before. If the figures of the cultivators before were illusory, then it was obvious that they were only condensed from multicolored light. In that case, his current body looked like it was real, and there was no difference between him and his shrunken body when he was a child. At this moment, a huge face appeared in the surroundings of the phenomena, looking over from afar. Among these faces, some were incomparably solid. For example, there were real faces like Luo Fans that were made of flesh and blood. Some of them were rather illusory. At most, they were similar to the ones that the cultivators who had appeared here before had enlarged their bodies. These faces only existed in the surroundings of every anomaly, and the distance between each abnormal scene was extremely far. This should have made these faces appear extremely sparse, causing people to involuntarily ignore them. However, the presence of these faces was unimaginably strong. After appearing around the abnormal scenes, all the attention that was directed at the abnormal scenes naturally shifted to these faces. In this way, the abnormal scenes in the void looked like huge faces that shone on all the cultivators that could see them from afar. This kind of scene was extremely horrifying and extremely strange. There were men and women, old and young, benevolent and cruel, sad and happy, helpless and happy, and all kinds of other faces. Almost all the possible situations that a living being could have were revealed. Among them, at least 80% are disciples of the Tao Master. Luo Fan sighed. It was actually very easy to distinguish whether they were disciples of the Tao Master or not. It was enough to see whether they knew how or why to use their concepts. This was the Tao Master's great world, and those disciples of the true saints were the Tao Master's personal disciples. Under such circumstances, how could those disciples of the Tao Master not know the magic of concepts? Perhaps, like Luo Fan, some of them were condensing their own worldviews in order to use their own worldviews to support their eternal existence in the state of chaos. In contrast, those rogue cultivators did not have the true teachings of the Tao Master, but they only knew how to use their concepts. Perhaps through various other means and opportunities, they could control and use their concepts, but in the end, they did not know the importance of the worldview, did not know how to organize and improve their own worldview, and did not know how to use the worldview to improve themselves. The aura formed by these two states was obviously completely different. In other words, at this moment, among the many faces that existed in the void, Luo Fan only needed to look at them to know which ones knew why and which ones just knew how. Thus, he could naturally infer which ones were disciples of the Tao Master, which ones were disciples of the true saints, and which ones were ordinary cultivators who had entered this area by chance to refine some strange landscape. You're very strong, but you shouldn't be here. Suddenly, a loud voice came into Luo Fan's ears out of nowhere. This voice was much louder and more mysterious than the previous voices. With this voice, the light in the void naturally evolved into all things in the world and all living beings in the universe. It looked as if the world was being created again. Seeing this, Luo Fan raised his eyebrows and said, "Not bad, but it's a little flashy." Can you imagine the means of the Tao Master's disciples? I'm only doing this to tell you that this is not a place where you can do as you please, the voice said again. His voice spread throughout the entire area and into the billions of anomalies in the area. Any cultivator who heard this voice couldn't believe their ears. Did I hear it wrong? Just now, the Tao Master's disciple seemed to be admitting his inferiority. A cultivator murmured, "You didn't hear it wrong. The Tao Master's disciple is indeed admitting his inferiority." He thinks that the person he's talking to is stronger than him. A cultivator who heard this responded. Chapter 2058. The Tao Master's disciple actually told the rogue cultivator that he could not do whatever he wanted here. This was simply like a weakling who had been forced into a corner telling a strong person, "What kind of backer do I have? You can't do anything to me." When had such a situation ever happened to a Tao Master's disciple before? Even if it had happened before, it must have been to the disciples of other Tao Masters. How could he say such a thing to a rogue cultivator who was not a Tao Master's disciple? This situation suddenly made those cultivators feel that the world had changed. Had they come to another reality? The disciples of the Tao Masters naturally understood the surprise and discussion of these cultivators. However, although they understood this, none of the disciples of the Tao Masters showed any extreme reactions. They were extremely proud of their status as disciples of the Tao Masters and thought that it was enough to distinguish them from all other cultivators, putting them in a position that was far superior to any other cultivator. However, this did not mean that they had become blind, nor did it mean that they would be blinded by this position. They would never fight to the death with an existence that they could not resist for the sake of face. Obviously, in their eyes, Luo Fan, who had just appeared in this area with a strange phenomenon, was an expert that they could not resist. In the face of such an expert, it was not a shameful thing to admit inferiority. They would be laughed at by others for admitting inferiority to such an expert. It was even less of a big deal. Of course, it wasn't because they were open-minded or carefree. It was, with their wisdom, they were confident that the cultivators who laughed at them would eventually find out that they were the ones who should laugh at them. Now, the more actively those cultivators laughed at them, the happier they would be in the end. Do whatever you want. It's quite ironic for you to say this. Luo Fan said lightly. His voice was leisurely. It spread throughout the entire area. It spread throughout the countless strange phenomena in the void, so that all the cultivators could clearly hear his words. This is the Tao Master's path. It was originally created by the elders of our sect. We have the most advantageous opportunity, so what's wrong with that? Furthermore, we've never restricted other cultivators from entering this place to share their opportunities with us. Just like now, when you enter, shouldn't we also express our welcome? The face said indifferently. Hearing this, all the cultivators were speechless. From a certain point of view, what this cultivator said was truly irrefutable. After all, the Tao Master's path was opened by many Tao Masters. For the disciples of the Tao Masters, wasn't this path created by their masters? If it was him, he would probably be heartbroken if he shared even a tiny bit of the opportunity created by his own stone door with an outsider. With this in mind, the Tao Master's disciples divided up this large area and monopolized it. There didn't seem to be anything unacceptable. The elders of the sect opened it. Luo Fan sneered. I'm afraid there were many Tao Masters who went through the Tao Master path and became Tao Masters. How many of you are disciples of such a Tao Master? This made the cultivator fall into silence. It was undeniable that there were many Tao Masters who obtained opportunities from the Tao Master path and became Tao Masters. In fact, they occupied 70 to 80% of the 3,000 Tao Masters in the Tao Master Great Universe. And among these Tao Masters, most of them were disciples of the previous Tao Masters. From the perspective of inheritance, the disciples of these Tao Masters could be said to be the disciples of the Tao Masters who first opened up the path of Tao Master. However, it was undeniable that there were also a small number of individual cultivators among the 70 to 80% of Tao Masters. In other words, they were not disciples of the previous Tao Masters. For these Tao Masters, unless they regarded the Tao Master path as the inheritance line of the first Tao Masters, it was difficult to be related to the Tao Masters who first opened the Tao Master path. In the end, Luo Fan made the final conclusion and said indifferently, "It's just a difference between the strong and the weak." Hearing this, the expressions of the faces in front of the many strange scenes changed. Although it was only a few words, Luo Fan's words had actually torn apart their original memorial archway. Now, unless there was an outbreak of internal strife and a small number of Tao masters were separated, it would be difficult to justify their monopolization of most of the opportunities here. Perhaps that's the case. In the end, the face that spoke just now sighed and admitted it. Although it seemed that he had been forced by Luo Fan to admit the fact that he had denied before, there was not the slightest bit of shame on his face, nor did he have any intention of correcting himself. There was only indifference, only calmness. In fact, there was really nothing to be ashamed of, nor was there anything to be corrected. In any world, the weak were prey to the strong. With strength, one could naturally occupy more resources. Without strength, one could only obtain the leftovers after the experts occupied the resources. In this respect, these Tao masters were actually considered to be lenient. Fellow Taoist, your strength has far surpassed the second level. You'd better leave quickly and go to a higher level. The face changed the topic at this time and said, Exactly. With your strength, it will be too much pressure for us here. It will greatly damage the balance of the entire second level. So we'd better hurry up and go to a higher level. One by one, the faces began to echo. In an instant, a huge sound wave formed in the entire area, rolling towards where Luo Fan was from all directions, causing the endless rays of light in the void to begin to surge, faintly forming an indescribable repulsive force, which was to expel Luo Fan from this area to a higher level of Tao Master. In this situation, it was obvious that these Tao Masters were no longer willing to see Luo Fan here. Even if it was not the main meaning, it must be a part of it. It must be a part of it. Feeling this repulsive force, Luo Fan's eyes lit up. Not bad, not bad. This kind of manipulation does indeed have the momentum of a Tao Master. This kind of rendering of the void and mobilizing the power of the void, or in other words, mobilizing the power of all the strange scenes in the void to mobilize the power of the entire second level of the Tao Master's path, was extremely exquisite. It made him feel the foundation of these Tao Masters. Of course, although this kind of method was exquisite and unparalleled, Luo Fan was not to be trifled with. He wanted to use this method to expel Luo Fan. It was also unlikely. At this time, Luo Fan's heart stirred, and the eternal world suddenly released endless light. This light was somewhat similar to the rays of light in the outside void, but in essence, it was completely different, even incompatible with the rays of light in the outside world. This light was none other than the transformation and condensation of the countless concepts contained in the eternal world. Judging from the source of these ideas, these condensed ideas were actually Luo Fan's worldview of the laws. Of course, because of the integration and transformation of the Tao Master's path, this worldview of the laws was already very different from the worldview of the laws that Luo Fan's current life origin had manifested, at least in terms of level. It had already improved by an unknown amount. As for the endless rays of light outside, they were endless concepts. These concepts were various and innumerable, and in essence, they were even more vast and boundless than Luo Fan's worldview. But the endless rays of light in the outside void had a weakness, and it was extremely scattered. Although it contained endless concepts, the concepts themselves did not form a truly perfect system, but were evenly distributed, like the air, like the heaven and earth yuan qi. In the void, the countless strange scenes in the entire void provided the concept incarnation formed by the numerous cultivators. Compared to the concepts emitted by the eternal world, this kind of light was like a diamond, and the other was like graphite. Diamond and graphite were the same element. But because of the difference in their structure, the hardness of the two was like heaven and earth. Among them, the light emitted by the eternal world, which was also the worldview that had been transformed by the Tao Master's path, was like a diamond, while the endless rays of light around it were like graphite. Or, from a higher point of view, there was no difference in the value of the two. However, for an existence at the level of Luo Fan, the value of the two was like heaven and earth. The power of the two was also like heaven and earth. Just like that, Even though the rays of light were not completely unaffected by the terrifying waves created by the endless rays of light, they still managed to block the endless rays of light outside as they fluctuated. As a result, both the eternal world and Luo Fan, who was inside it, were no longer affected by the terrifying repulsive force produced by it. They were still firmly in this area, in the second layer of the Tao Master's path. It was even to the extent that even his concept incarnation wasn't really affected at this moment. It still existed outside the eternal world, and it was enveloped by the boundless light. It seemed like a god of creation. How is this possible? This is complete. Suddenly, many people below the Tao Masters were shocked. How can this cultivation method succeed? He didn't build it step by step, but from the very beginning, he actually came here from the side road. This person has the qualifications to become a Tao Master. At this time, all kinds of discussions continue to come from all directions. The faces that emerged in front of the many strange scenes exclaimed inexplicably. Their faces became distorted, and it was almost impossible to see how many of them could maintain their original calmness. This kind of voice reverberated in the large void and spread to the ears of countless cultivators, making their hearts tremble indescribably. All of their expressions became puzzled and ugly. They could understand every single word spoken by these Tao Masters, but when put together, they couldn't understand anything at all. I didn't expect that someone would choose this kind of cultivation. At this time, a voice rang out from nowhere, instantly suppressing all the discussions. It suppressed the terrifying impact sound that reverberated in the entire void, causing the entire void to calm down. Then, a huge face appeared in the void. This face was so huge that it was beyond imagination. It seemed to blot out the sky and cover the earth, shrouding all the phenomena and the faces above. Compared to it, any strange scene, any huge face, they were like ants. At this moment, Luo Fan furrowed his brows and narrowed his eyes. He stared at the deepest part of the void, looking at a peculiar scene in the deepest part. That anomaly was pitch black and didn't emit any light in the void. On the contrary, the light emitted by the other anomalies was attracted by it and eventually disappeared into the pitch-black anomaly. The whole strange scene looked like a huge black hole. It was precisely because of this that Luo Fan had not noticed that strange scene. He also did not notice that there were no faces in that strange scene. At this moment, he sensed that the huge face that towered above all the other faces was coming from that strange phenomenon. In other words, the owner of this face was in that incomparably huge black hole. The face looked like that of a young man. This young man's face could only be considered ordinary, but the wisdom in his eyes surpassed that of any cultivator that Luo Fan had seen in so many worlds, even true saints and Tao Masters. He naturally understood that it was not because he had surpassed the true saint or the Tao Master, but because the true saint and the Tao Master Luo Fan could not understand at all, let alone recognize the subtlety and mystery of it. Greetings, second senior brother. At this time, all the faces began to change and turn into figures that bowed to the face and greeted. There were hundreds of millions of cultivators under the 3,000 Tao Masters, and they all called this person senior brother at the same time. One could imagine the prestige of this cultivator. It went without saying how strong he was. If it was not for his strength that could suppress everyone and make all the Tao Masters submit to him, such a thing would not have happened. Junior brothers and sisters, there is no need to be so polite. The face smiled and said lightly. These words were very ordinary, but no power or barrier could stop them. They were directly transmitted into the ears of all living beings, and even made them naturally want to obey these words. They naturally wanted to act according to the will of these words. Yes, the many Tao Masters responded at this time. Then, one by one, the figures turned to look at Luo Fan. There was a flash of understanding in their eyes, and even more of surprise. It seemed that the appearance of the second senior brother, because of Luo Fan, made Luo Fan different, and changed their view of Luo Fan a little. How powerful! Luo Fan just said lightly. The second senior brother's face slightly froze, and in the blink of an eye, he had already turned into a figure that appeared in front of the consciousness incarnation of Luo Fan, and said with an extremely humble look, "This is an unwritten rule of our Tao Masters. If you're interested, I can explain it to you. In fact, there are many of us under the Tao Masters, and in the past, when no one was willing to submit to anyone, many unspeakable things happened. Finally, after countless years of development, a senior finally came up with such a solution. In each layer of the Tao Master Path, the strongest person will be chosen to become the leader of that layer. I was lucky to defeat all the junior brothers and sisters, so I became the leader of the second layer and was called the second senior brother. It should be the same in other layers." Hearing this, Luo Fan suddenly understood. The second layer was the second senior brother. The third layer should be the third senior brother. The fourth layer should be the fourth senior brother, and so on. This structure could not be said to be very exquisite, but it could be regarded as the integration of the entire layer of the Tao Master Path, and it could be regarded as a way to solve the contradictions between each other, and it could also be regarded as slightly easing the contradictions. It is really unexpectedly simple and crude. Luo Fan just said, "It is indeed simple and crude, but there is no other way. After all, our real task is to cultivate, and everything else is secondary." The second senior brother said with a smile. Then, he changed the topic and said with a smile, "These are all secondary. This time I appeared, there is something that I don't understand, and I want to ask you." Luo Fan said lightly, "You can ask, but I may not necessarily answer." Although the second senior brother in front of him was extremely strong in the second layer of the Tao Master Path, and could even suppress all the other Tao Masters, and had even vaguely reached the level of a 3 tribulations expert. But to him, he was still just a weakling. He still had enough confidence to easily crush him. Under such circumstances, there was naturally no need for him to indulge in such a situation. The second senior brother did not respond to his words, but many of the other Tao Master's disciples were already shouting in displeasure. "How dare you!" This voice directly swept up the endless rays of light in the entire void, causing these rays of light to wildly surge, creating a terrifying wave that directly swept towards the eternal heaven and earth, and also towards Luo Fan. In the face of these waves, Luo Fan only faintly smiled and did not even do anything. The light released from the eternal heaven and earth had already in a slight tremble, and all the waves had been completely cut off, and Luo Fan himself was in the slightest bit unaffected. The second senior brother said indifferently, "Junior brothers and junior sisters, don't take it to heart. This fellow Taoist strength is qualified to say so." Chapter 2059. Luo Fan looked at this scene, but his expression did not change at all. It was as if everything in front of him was just a normal scene of wind blowing leaves and water flowing from high to low. At this time, second senior brother said to Luo Fan, "I once asked Master if there was any other way to become a Tao Master other than the normal cultivation method of us Tao Masters." His words were no longer transmitted to all parts of the void, but only to the place where he and Luo Fan were. After all, this was the key to becoming a true divine. No matter how generous he was, even if most of the people here were disciples of Tao Masters, this secret was not a secret to them, and he could not spread it without scruples. Hearing this, Luo Fan could not help but be a little curious. The method of becoming a sage that he had comprehended now was based on the several ancient books he had obtained in the great Tianyuan world. Now, it had even completely surpassed the scope of those ancient books. Even if the cultivators in the great Tianyuan world saw his cultivation method, they would not be able to imagine that it was developed from the cultivation method in their great world. In other words, his current cultivation method could be said to be completely his own cultivation method, the method of becoming a sage. In this way, he was naturally quite interested in the cultivation methods of the Tao Masters and the explanations of the Tao Masters on the method of becoming a sage. Second senior brother did not intend to keep him in suspense. He continued, "At that time, Master said that the most important thing for us to cultivate is our own world. No matter what we cultivate, no matter what incredible divine sense we have, No matter how vast the Dharma power we obtain in the end, as long as we don't have our own world, everything will be empty. Own world. Hearing this, Luo Fan immediately understood that this was his own world. It must be the world that he knew. His own world, a world that completely belonged to him. Naturally, it was a unique world that belonged to him, and was completely different from any other person or living creature. When the second senior brother saw the expression on Luo Fan's face that was as clear as day, the little bit of doubt that still existed had completely disappeared. Before this, although he was sure that he had seen through Luo Fan and felt that Luo Fan also knew how important his own world was, he was not certain. After all, he still had some doubts in his heart. Until now, when he saw that Luo Fan didn't have the slightest doubt when he heard about his own world. On the contrary, he seemed to have understood it. He even seemed to be amazed by the name of his own world. Now, he was completely sure of his own guess. He knew that Luo Fan was like them, a powerful being who understood the key to his own world. Since he understood this, he naturally no longer had any misgivings. Back then, I asked you if you wanted to create your own world. What should he do? His master just stretched out 2 fingers and said, "There is righteousness." The 2 ways of reversal. The righteous path was to spend an immeasurable amount of time to build and adjust one's own world bit by bit. Finally, after an immeasurable amount of time, one would spend an immeasurable amount of mana and obtain an immeasurable amount of knowledge to truly build one's own world. On the other hand, the righteous path was to reach the sky in a single step. First, one would build one's own world, and then adjust it bit by bit. It would be perfected bit by bit, and in the end, the righteous path would grow to a sufficient level, the second senior brother said. He looked at Luo Fan with a burning gaze, as if he wanted to dig out every thought in his heart from his face, every change in his heart. However, it was obvious that with Luo Fan's intelligence, he naturally couldn't be seen through by the second senior brother when he was prepared. At this time, he was expressionless and only quietly listened to the second senior brother's explanation. The second senior brother couldn't see anything and continued. The righteous path is without tribulations and immeasurable. Although all kinds of immeasurable energy are consumed, there is still a 1 in a billion chance of attaining the way. On the other hand, the righteous path is full of tribulations. Although it is faster, the chance of attaining the way is less than 1 in a billion. At this time, the second senior brother's observation ability had been raised to the peak. He could almost sense all the changes in Luo Fan's body, and even all the changes in the surrounding environment. He wanted to infer what kind of changes in Luo Fan's mind from all this. However, it was a pity that Luo Fan looked like a statue. He didn't change at all because of the second senior brother's words. He just stood there quietly with a calm expression, as if he didn't hear anything. At this time, the second senior brother finally frowned. The situation in front of him was completely different from what he had expected. If the other party had really used the reverse method to create his own world as he had thought, he would definitely be horrified by now. Unless, could it be that you already knew about this? I can see that you seem to have an aura that doesn't belong to this world. You must have come from another world or a perfect world. Did you already know about this before you came here? The second senior brother frowned and asked, "You can actually see that I'm not born and raised in this world. Yes, I didn't hide it. After all, you're the disciple of the Tao Master, so it's normal for you to be able to see through it." I was wrong. Luo Fan raised his eyebrows and said, "I can only see through it because you've only been in this world for a short time. After a few billion years, you will no longer have any aura from other worlds, and no one will be able to see through it," the second senior brother said with a smile. "However, you've guessed one thing wrong. I didn't know about what you said long ago." Luo Fan smiled. "Oh." The second senior brother was curious. If he didn't know about it, why was he so calm at this time? Could it be that he had really reached this stage? Yes. In fact, before you mention it, I never knew that there were 2 ways to achieve Tao, the righteous path and the inverse path. All this time, I only knew the way I cultivated. Even when I encountered many tribulations before, I only thought that it was inevitable in a test before achieving Tao. I never thought that it was actually a punishment for going against the inverse path. Luo Fan sighed and seemed a little emotional. Of course, it was just a little emotional. There was no regret, and there was no fear. Seeing him like this, the second senior brother's face was full of admiration and said, I didn't expect you to be so open-minded even after knowing all this. Compared to you, I'm far inferior. If I were in your situation, I would definitely be full of regret and even want to ask for a way to change my cultivation. Luo Fan listened. He just smiled and said, Don't joke, fellow Taoist. With your temperament, even if you knew, you definitely wouldn't be like this. The second senior brother just laughed and didn't answer. Although what he said just now was a compliment to Luo Fan. In fact, he was pointing out that such a way to change one's cultivation did exist. He was even pointing it out. He had a way to change one's cultivation. As for his purpose, although it was not clear yet, he must have a corresponding condition to exchange with Luo Fan. Even the reason he came here this time was because he wanted to obtain something from Luo Fan, which was the condition of the exchange. Otherwise, how could he, the second senior brother, who was the leader of hundreds of millions of Dao Masters on the second level of the Dao Master's path, condescend to talk to Luo Fan in such a peaceful manner? Did he really think that the disciples of a Dao Master were the same as ordinary cultivators? After a while, the second senior brother suddenly said, Fellow Taoist, I think you already know what I mean. What do you think? Luo Fan just faintly smiled and said, Although it was by chance that I embarked on this path, it was only by chance. But this is already my Tao. I have never thought of giving up my Tao. Perhaps, to change one's cultivation, you don't have to give up your Tao. With your ability, I think you know how powerful a Tao Master is. Don't you think that the Tao Master can create the most suitable cultivation method for you? The second senior brother said with a smile, Of course I know that the Tao Master can create such a cultivation method. But so what? To change one's cultivation is to deny the past. No matter how exquisite the cultivation method is, no matter how complete the cultivation results of a king can be, denial is denial. This fact will never change. Luo Fan just said faintly. As he spoke, there was an inexplicable vicissitudes in his eyes. His eyes seemed to penetrate the infinite distance and see countless scenes that the second senior brother did not understand or even imagine. The second senior brother was about to say something, but Luo Fan continued, And I don't think so. The right way is really stronger than the wrong way. Is there really such a big difference between 1 in a billion and 1 in a billion? In my opinion, for any cultivator, there is not much difference between grasping a 1 in a billion chance and grasping a 1 in a billion. It's simply stupid to distort one's mind and walk on a path that is beyond one's mind for the sake of an almost identical chance. Hearing this, the second senior brother looked regretful. It seems that I'm also one of the stupid people you mentioned. Even so, there was no anger on his face. On the contrary, he still maintained his previous calmness, as if what Luo Fan said was not about him at all. This situation was enough to show how strong the second senior brother's mind was. If you really like what I said, you're naturally a stupid person too. Luo Fan just smiled. Maybe. However, my path was pointed out by the Tao Master. It's the path that has the highest chance of becoming a Tao Master. In contrast, your path was just deduced by yourself. The second senior brother said with a smile, Forget it. Since you're unwilling, there's nothing else to say. This area is originally part of the Tao Master's path. Since you can enter here, you're naturally free to cultivate here. I just hope that you won't disturb my junior brothers and sisters. After all, it's not easy for us to cultivate. The second senior brother just said. When Luo Fan heard this, he just nodded faintly and did not say anything more. He had a fundamentally different view from the second senior brother. For the second senior brother, the Tao Master's guidance was the correct path. As for other paths, even if it was exaggerated and he could not refute it, as long as it was different from what the Tao Master said, it was naturally wrong. There was no need to think about it at all. Therefore, at this time for him, it did not matter what Luo Fan said, no matter how reasonable he thought what Luo Fan said, or even how much he agreed with it. Even if Luo Fan said that he was just a fool, He just sneered in his heart. He felt that Luo Fan was ignorant, a frog at the bottom of a well, and did not know the vastness and subtlety of the cultivation world. As for his mentality, Luo Fan just thought for a while and already knew it clearly. At this time, he just smiled secretly. He did not think that he could compare with the Tao Master. He could compare with a true sage. He did not think that his cultivation way was better than that of a true sage. He did not think that his understanding of the world could crush a true sage, or even be comparable to a true sage, however. But he clearly knew what he was pursuing now, to become a true sage. That was to become a Tao Master in this Tao Master universe. This was almost as ridiculous as an ant challenging the whole universe. To succeed in such a challenge, the method was very important, but the most important thing was his own will. It was the kind of will that insisted that he would succeed and win. This kind of will was not the kind of power called will that existed in the body in the past, but the kind of real support that existed in the deepest part of the soul from the root of living beings. It was a kind of invisible and intangible core idea that even Luo Fan could not extract at this time. With a strong enough will and a theoretically feasible method, it was possible to succeed. Under such circumstances, if he distorted his own will to improve the feasibility of the method, it was simply as ridiculous as taking away the bones to strengthen the muscles when strengthening the body of a living being. Obviously, for Luo Fan, experiencing the Great Tribulation again and again, perfecting and improving his Tao worldview. Finally, when he reached the end, he would obtain eternal immortality and not be worn down by thousands of tribulations. This was his path, and it was the persistence of his will. It was also the state where his bones and muscles were perfectly combined. In contrast, by modifying the cultivation transformation method into the so-called righteous way, he would no longer experience the Great Tribulation. Instead, he would accumulate immeasurable consumption to reach the end, which was equivalent to taking away his bones and strengthening his muscles. How could he succeed? It was precisely because of this understanding that he had firmly rejected the second senior brother just now. He was even unwilling to obtain the cultivation transformation method. Moreover, what we are pursuing now is to become a true sage. It is to achieve the same level as those Tao Masters. Is this really achievable by completely following the method created by those Tao Masters? Such a thought suddenly flashed in Luo Fan's mind. This kind of thinking, it was absolutely impossible for him to have such a thought, because the stronger he was, the more he could feel the power of a Tao Master, which was also the power of a true sage, and the more he could understand how big the gap between him and a true sage was. Naturally, he would gradually develop a kind of fear and even fear of a true sage. However, as his Tao worldview was perfected, his ability to use the concept gradually increased, and his understanding of the essence of the Tao worldview became deeper and deeper. He gradually understood that no matter how strong a Tao Master was in essence, it was only his own future. It could even be said that it was just a realm that he wanted to surpass. For such an existence, such a realm, why should he be afraid? Why should he be afraid? With such an awareness, his mind naturally regained its clarity, and all kinds of other thoughts about a Tao Master naturally emerged. Originally, it would not have been possible for him to refute and disobey a Tao Master, but also naturally appeared. From a certain point of view, the current him could be considered to have the real foundation to achieve Tao, and had the heart and mind to become a true sage. This was also the result of tempering him through the great tribulations again and again. It was also the performance of him climbing step by step to become a true sage. Of course, this was only a change in his temperament. In fact, his strength, his cultivation realm, was still unimaginably far from a true sage. Even under the Tao Master, there might be many who were superior to him. Naturally, there was no such Tao Master in the second level of the Tao Master's path. But in the third, fourth, fifth, sixth, and even higher levels, it was not necessarily the case. All kinds of thoughts flashed through his mind, and gradually an inexplicable penetrating light emitted from Luo Fan's mind. In a trance, his mind seemed to be much clearer, and his thinking was much clearer. Even his cultivation realm had a subtle improvement, and the existence of the fifth Great Tribulation that he could vaguely sense previously became a little clearer. This is an unexpected gain. At this time, this thought flashed through Luo Fan's mind, and a calm and confident smile hung on his face. This change did not mean that all kinds of responses just now were correct, and it did not mean that his previous understanding was in line with the path to become a sage. It only meant that his response just now was in line with his mind, and his understanding just now had also strengthened his confidence and made his thoughts clear. With this thought, the incarnation of his idea shook slightly and then completely disappeared. His mind quickly returned to his true body in the eternal heaven and earth. He began to integrate his mind into the countless worlds in the eternal heaven and earth. He began to sense the concepts that belonged to his worldview that had fused with the countless worlds. At the same time, the light that had been radiating from the eternal world began to slowly retract. In the end, it completely retracted into the surroundings of the eternal world, turning into a barrier of light that enveloped the eternal world. It made the eternal world extremely conspicuous among the endless strange scenes in the void. It felt like a pearl amidst countless grains of sand and stones. Chapter 2060. Over the next 10,000 years, the area occupied by the Tao Master's disciples fell into a strange silence. The 10 billion cultivators that Luo Fan had brought in from the second level of the Tao Master's path seemed to not exist. They did not affect this area at all, nor did they affect the countless phenomena within it. The entire area looked as if they did not exist at all. In this situation, it was obvious that the performance of the disciples of the Tao Masters had already brought them an unimaginable shock. It had cast a huge shadow in their hearts, and they did not dare to challenge the scene they were in. Of course, Luo Fan's existence also frightened them and left a huge shadow in their hearts. Therefore, apart from the cultivators that were still in the eternal world, none of the other cultivators that had left the eternal world dared to step into it again. Such cultivators made up nearly half of the 10 billion cultivators. In other words, close to 5 billion cultivators did not step into the eternal world, nor did they step into any of the other abnormal scenes. Instead, they stayed in the void. Of course, these cultivators did not stay in the void to stare blankly. In fact, every cultivator was extremely busy. After all, the multicolored light that filled the void was a mysterious existence that they had never seen before. To them, the countless concepts contained within were mysterious powers that they could only dream of obtaining. Under such circumstances, how could they not try to absorb and integrate the multicolored light? Which of these didn't require a lot of time? Which of these didn't require a lot of energy? Under such circumstances, how could they not be busy? In fact, it was precisely because of them. However, they had become a brand new landscape in this area. After all, as cultivators that could be called second tribulation experts at that. Of course, it was impossible for the 5 billion cultivators to just sit there quietly in the void. They had to open up cave dwellings and Tao grounds. At the very least, they had to have a barrier that could hide them from other people's detection. Under such circumstances, settlements and void cities were naturally formed in the midst of the many anomalies. 5 billion cultivators was not a lot, but it was not a small number either. But it was enough to form a complete society and establish perfect rules. After tens of thousands of years, it was as if they were born and raised in the void of this region. It's a pity that although this power is limitless in terms of quantity, it's not enough. However, its essence is simply too high, and an existence of my level is simply unable to fuse with it. On this day, in a certain void city, a cultivator who looked like a young man cursed hatefully. These cities were formed by the billions of cultivators over the past 10,000 years, and they were the settlements of many cultivators. We can't. Without those phenomena, there's no way we can fuse these powers. I still have to enter the abnormal landscape and take the risk. Then, the young man's thoughts turned, and he thought. At this moment, a voice came from the doorway. Even the disciples of Taoist master and that expert have to rely on the unusual landscape as a transit. We can only be weaker than them, not stronger. With such a foundation, we can't do what they can't do. That's just wishful thinking. The young man frowned and said, "It's you? Looks like you haven't made any breakthroughs either." Following that, the door to the youngster's cultivation chamber opened to reveal a middle-aged cultivator. "It's like this every time. Can't you leave me some privacy?" The young man sighed. "I set up the formations here anyway. If you want privacy, you can change it yourself." The middle-aged man chuckled. "If I had the ability to change it, would I still need your formations?" The young man rolled his eyes. Everyone had their own specialties, even a second tribulation expert. Even a second tribulation expert, like him, had their own specialties. Even though it was what they were least good at. Compared to cultivators who were weaker than them, they were unimaginably strong. But compared to other existences of the same level, the difference in strength between them was still very obvious. For example, this young man's attainments and formations were far inferior to the middle-aged man's. He might even be the kind that would be beaten up. Otherwise, he wouldn't need to ask the middle-aged man for such a defensive formation, and he wouldn't be cultivating in seclusion in the cultivation room at this time. The middle-aged man could completely see through his every move and could even come and go freely. Of course, from this, it could be seen how much trust they had in each other. They could even be called Tao companions with deep feelings for each other. "Let's go." The middle-aged man chuckled and said, "Where to?" The young cultivator frowned. "Is there need to ask? Haven't you already made up your mind? Why are you still pretending?" The middle-aged man said with dissatisfaction. Hearing this, the young man smiled bitterly and said, "Can you leave me some face? You can see through everything I'm thinking. This is really too frustrating." As they spoke, they had already left the cultivation place and were heading towards another location in the city. This void city was incomparably huge, almost like a vast world. Even if there were hundreds of millions of people cultivating in such a vast void city, it wouldn't feel crowded in the slightest. Going from one location in the city to another was more like flying from one location on the continent to another, unlike in a normal city. "Don't worry, you'll get used to it once you've failed. Let's go, they're still waiting for us." This time, I found a total of 6 fellow Taoists that I can trust. As long as we have their help, we could try to enter a phenomenon. The middle-aged man thought about the young man as he flew. "I think that the eternal world is more suitable," the young man suddenly said. His words came out of nowhere, but the middle-aged man knew exactly what he was talking about. He only said, "We'll have to discuss this before we can decide. However, for me, I still don't think that the eternal world is suitable." Hearing this, the young man frowned and said, "You still think he's too strong?" "That's right. It's not like he didn't see how courteous those Tao Master's disciples were to him. They didn't even care about being looked down upon. I can't help but think about how much control this kind of expert has over the phenomenon he's in. I think that's the best choice." At this moment, another voice interrupted. Before they knew it, they had already arrived at another location in the city, in front of another cave abode. At this moment, there were already 6 cultivators waiting for them in front of the cave abode. The one who had interrupted just now was a woman. The woman's expression was cold and solemn, as if she was a block of ice. Anyone who got close to her would feel waves of chills. The strength of the owner of that phenomenon is secondary. The most important thing is that he needs us for his cultivation. The woman's words seemed to split heaven and earth, causing all the cultivators present to freeze in shock. How is that possible? This was clearly the first time she had spoken of her speculation. The cultivators who had been with her before had never heard of such a theory from her. At this moment, the middle-aged man and the young man simultaneously displayed expressions of disbelief and shock. Did you not feel it? He's taking the initiative to attract other cultivators into the eternal world, the woman said indifferently. Hearing this, the others' eyes shone with contemplation. At first, they were at a loss, but as time passed, as they thought about the matter more and more clearly, expressions of disbelief finally appeared on their faces. Although it was difficult to grasp the veins, everything that had happened in the eternal world seemed to be exactly as the woman had said. It was precisely the cultivator who had forced the Tao Master's disciples to treat him politely, who had taken the initiative to lead them, the cultivators on the second level of the Tao Master's path, into the eternal world. Knowing this, they naturally came to a sudden realization as to why that woman would say such a thing. Everything a cultivator did, at the end of the day, was for the sake of cultivation, for the sake of self-improvement, for the sake of self-improvement. The eternal world's dominator was obviously no exception. Since he had taken the initiative to let the cultivators enter, it clearly meant that he most likely needed their help in his cultivation. If that's the case, I think it's even more impossible for us to enter. The middle-aged man sighed at this moment. Why? The woman frowned. He needs our help in his cultivation. Isn't he treating us like chess pieces? What if he has a sudden impulse one day and uses us as sacrificial pawns? Wouldn't we die without a grave? The middle-aged man said directly, as the ruler of the eternal world, he has the ability to use us as sacrificial pawns. In reality, in this area, the situation is the same for every anomaly. There's no difference. There's no difference between choosing this and choosing the others, the woman said indifferently at this moment. Her words made the middle-aged man momentarily speechless. This was the truth. Even if he wanted to deny it, he couldn't find a way to do so. I've decided to enter the eternal world, a cultivator said. I've also decided to enter, another cultivator beside him said. In the end, apart from the middle-aged cultivator, the other 7 among the 8 had decided to enter the eternal world. Only the middle-aged cultivator was still a little hesitant, unable to make a decision. What's the point of hesitating? After watching for so many years, have you ever seen the ruler casually toy with cultivators cultivating in the eternal world? The young man hurriedly tried to dissuade him. He wasn't speaking carelessly. In reality, he had indeed observed the eternal world. After all, he'd long since decided that if he were to enter an anomaly in the future, the eternal world would be the best choice. Since he'd already made up his mind, how could he not investigate the survival rate of cultivators in the eternal world? Of course, the direction of his investigation was obviously different from the woman's. The woman had only investigated because she knew that the ruler needed cultivators to help him cultivate, but he'd investigated without knowing. All right, then let's go to the eternal world. The middle-aged man gritted his teeth and finally agreed. The others laughed when they saw his agreement. It didn't matter if the middle-aged man didn't join them. They wouldn't change their minds about entering the eternal world just because of this. However, the middle-aged man was the one who'd gathered them for this adventure. If he didn't join, the situation would be a little awkward. After deciding on their destination, they didn't hesitate any longer and hurried toward the eternal world in the distance. This city in the void wasn't too far away from the eternal world. Even though they weren't traveling at their fastest speed and were only traveling at a leisurely pace, it didn't take them more than 2 hours to reach the eternal world. However, it only took them less than 2 hours to arrive outside of the eternal heaven and earth, arriving at the area enveloped by the light emitted by the eternal heaven and earth. Although the light emitted from the eternal world could block out the light from the outside world, it didn't hinder their arrival at all. They passed through the light without being affected in the slightest and arrived outside the eternal world. This world has actually become like this. The 8 of them were all shocked when they saw the anomaly that they hadn't approached for 10,000 years. From the outside, the indestructible world didn't look too different from the outside. But from the inside, the indestructible world didn't look too different. However, from the inside, it had already undergone an earth-shattering transformation. The entire eternal heaven and earth looked like a giant sitting cross-legged amidst the light. Specks of light flickered and swam around his body. Endless principles and mysteries were revealed as these specks of light flickered and swam. The incomparably strong aura of indestructibility had become so strong that it was almost tangible, causing the 8 cultivators to feel as if their bodies and minds had been inexplicably cleansed. The image of this enormous eternal world was just like the ruler of the eternal world they'd seen before. It was just a little blurry, and some of the details weren't very clear. What an impressive eternal seal! The young cultivator suddenly exclaimed in admiration. Following his exclamation, the other cultivators finally noticed that the giant figure's hands were forming a mysterious seal in his dantian. This seal was made with the left hand above and the right hand below. The two hands seemed to be inverting, but not inverting. In a trance, it seemed as if trillions of changes were being compressed between the two hands. At every moment, it seemed as if there were countless worlds, countless space-time, and countless mysterious worlds forming between the seal, solidifying, and becoming a part of the seal. It became a completely new transformation of the seal. The moment they saw the seal, everyone felt an indescribable shock in their hearts. That intense aura of indestructibility. It seeped into their bodies and was deeply imprinted in their hearts. It was imprinted on their life essence and couldn't be erased. In that instant, the eight of them couldn't help but simultaneously form the seal in the same way the giant figure had done. However, every cultivator gave up with a wry smile in the end. There were simply too many changes in the seal. Even though they were experts who'd passed through the second tribulation, they couldn't form the seal at all. It was fine if they failed every time. It just didn't reveal any of its profundities. Once their hands matched the changes in the seal, they suddenly felt their blood boil. It was as if an unimaginably terrifying destructive force was being produced from a seal. It was about to seep into their bodies and cause them to explode. How could they dare to continue after sensing such terror? It seems that in these years, this place has changed much more than we imagined. Perhaps we've already missed a huge opportunity. The young man finally sighed. The other cultivators' expressions darkened when they heard this. Just the mysteriousness of the seal alone was enough to tell just how inconceivable the eternal world had changed over the years. If it really did represent an opportunity, then just how great was that opportunity? None of them dared to imagine. How could they possibly feel good after learning that they might have missed such an opportunity? Since it's just a layer of light and everything is so different, perhaps what we've investigated before isn't accurate anymore. Do we still want to go in? The middle-aged man suddenly spoke up. The others frowned slightly when they heard this. Although the middle-aged man's words were a little too cautious, they still made some sense. They'd collectively decided to enter the eternal world because they'd investigated the survival rates of the cultivators inside. Their current survival rates might not be accurate. It might just be the result of the eternal world distorting their senses. Either way, it was still dangerous. Everyone, take your time to think about it. I'll be leaving first. At this moment, one of the cultivators spoke up. Without waiting for the others to reply, he turned around and directly headed towards the eternal world. In the blink of an eye, he'd already rushed inside and disappeared before everyone's eyes. The other cultivators roared with laughter when they saw this scene, and then they spoke one after another before stepping into the eternal world. In the end, only the middle-aged cultivator, the young cultivator, and the woman were left here. Seeing this, the middle-aged cultivator smiled bitterly and said, "It looks like I'm really not material for an organization. I didn't think my first attempt would fail like this." "You'll get better after a few more tries," the young cultivator consoled. Chapter 2061. P.S. May 1st update. Don't rush to play after reading it. Remember to vote for the monthly ticket first. From now on, you can enjoy double the monthly ticket for the 5/15 Fan Festival. You can also watch other events with red packets. As soon as the three of them stepped into the eternal world, they instantly felt that the eternal world was different from before. In the past, when they left the eternal world, it was hazy and seemed to be in a state of chaos. Even they couldn't clearly see what was going on. However, at this time, the interior of the eternal world had become an incomparably huge three-dimensional network. This three-dimensional network wasn't regular at all. It looked like countless traffic roads were connected together, and the entire eternal world was connected together. In such a network, every part of the world was on the nodes of this network. Obviously, this entire network was really a road that connected the various worlds. At this time, countless cultivators came and went on these roads. Although the entire eternal world didn't seem very lively, it was no longer as lonely as before. The 5 people who entered the eternal world before were already scattered all over the world in their eyes. But now, after entering, they saw that the 5 of them were actually just a step in front of them on the road. How did it become like this? I seem to have heard that there seems to be a layer in the chaos that's structured like this. The middle-aged cultivator murmured. Although he was only a cultivator at the 2nd level of the Tao Sovereign Path, he was still a cultivator from the Tao Sovereign Great World. His knowledge was much higher than that of other cultivators from the other perfect worlds. Although it was impossible to be completely clear about the composition of the state of chaos, there were all kinds of rumors. In the end, it was still possible to find out. According to the legends he had heard, there was clearly a layer in the state of chaos. It used these roads to connect the many perfect worlds. The great world, as for why it was a layer, this was also a sign of their knowledge. In the eyes of these cultivators from the Tao Sovereign Great World, the state of chaos was not an existence like the normal void. It was not an existence like a normal void, but something similar to the road of Tao Master. In other words, it was divided into layers. However, compared to the Tao Sovereign Path, the layers of the state of chaos were more mysterious and difficult to understand. Even the difference between the levels was more complicated. It was said that within it, there was a vast universe of negative emotions. There was even an incomparably massive and perfect transportation network. It was said that there was an infinite number of chaos life forms living in this world, a universe of positive emotions, as well as a universe of primordial essence spirit treasures. As long as one wanted to find it, they could find it. They had even heard that the number of levels in the state of chaos had reached an infinite level. That sovereign is simulating the state of primordial chaos, the woman murmured. There was an indescribable shock and understanding in his eyes. They were shocked because of the sovereign's boldness and boldness. He had accomplished things that they had never even dared to imagine. However, he had gained enlightenment from the sovereign's boldness. This made her vaguely aware of what her cultivation was lacking, and why she had always been limited to the 2nd level of the Tao Master's path, unable to break through. Perhaps it was because she lacked such boldness that she had not been able to progress for billions of years. It was obvious that the 5 cultivators before them were also shocked and stood there in a daze. Hey, there's finally a newcomer? At this moment, a voice came from behind them. The 8 of them turned around at the same time. They saw 3 cultivators walking leisurely not far behind them. The one who had spoken just now was a rather short and stout old man. How did you know that we're newcomers? The middle-aged man asked. They were newcomers, and they had no intention of hiding this. After all, it wasn't something to be ashamed of, but what surprised them was that the other party had been able to see through it with a single glance. After all, there are almost 5 billion cultivators like them in the eternal world, and there were even more living beings that had been born from the various worlds. He didn't believe that any cultivator would be able to remember all of them and be able to discern with a single glance that they didn't belong to that world. What's so hard about guessing? Your shocked expressions are the best proof. A young woman beside the short and stout old man giggled. Only after hearing her words did the 8 of them come to a sudden realization. Each of their faces revealed a look of understanding and some embarrassment. They'd actually overlooked such a simple fact just now. If they were used to the scenes inside the eternal realm, they naturally wouldn't be as shocked as they were right now. Such shock could only mean that they were newcomers, and that this was the first time they'd seen something like this. We haven't seen the eternal realm for a long time, and we've only just stepped into it. I wonder if you can teach me? The middle-aged man smiled and bowed to the short and stout old man. We're all fellow cultivators, so of course there's no problem. The short and stout old man laughed. It wasn't a big deal to begin with. If they could form some good karma, the old man obviously wouldn't be stingy with a few words of advice. The 8 were all delighted when they heard this. They immediately mixed with the 3 of them and began moving forward step by step along the path. During this process, the old man began to slowly explain the changes that had occurred inside the eternal realm over the years. These were clearly the old man's personal experiences, and they had left an extremely deep impression in his heart. Even though he was recounting them now, he still seemed rather emotional, and there was even a hint of deep admiration in his voice. As it turned out, the cultivators who'd stayed behind in the Eternal Realm had been living in constant fear, worried about how the ruler would treat them. There were even many cultivators who'd secretly escaped from the Eternal Realm. However, on a certain day, the many worlds within the Eternal World started to glow. All kinds of incomparably pure and strange energy began to spread through the entire Eternal Realm along with the light. It was like the endless light of the stars had begun to spread through the entire universe. These incomparably pure and mysterious energies were clearly intimately connected to each other. After they were mixed together, they began to resonate and gradually fuse together. This caused the space of the Eternal World to turn gray and hazy. The existences that seemed to be in a state of chaos were enveloped by the light and then shone upon by it. Their existence began to weaken bit by bit. In the end, the interior of the Eternal Realm seemed to be the same as the void outside, which was covered in endless multicolored light. It had turned into a void filled with light. This was also the first time the true appearance of the Eternal Realm was revealed to the countless cultivators inside the Eternal Realm. Originally, after arriving here, it was already enough to shock many cultivators. However, the changes to the Eternal Realm didn't stop there. After that, even more powerful changes began to appear. After that, the light did not stop there. Instead, it began to seep into the grayish existence that seemed to be in a state of chaos, gradually fusing with it. In the end, after a few hundred years, it completely fused with it, causing the two to become inseparable. It was as if they'd become a complete entity. At this moment, wisps of mysterious existences that were different from the fused light began to break away from the fusion of the light and the dusky existences in the boundless void. After the mysterious existences broke away, they didn't converge in a single place. Instead, they continuously spread out, gradually fusing with the entire Eternal Realm. Or rather, they fused with the outer barrier of the Eternal Realm. It was also at this moment that the barrier of the Eternal Realm gradually began to change. From its original sun-like appearance, it gradually shrank and deformed. In the end, after several hundred years, it had completely transformed into its current appearance. A human figure sat cross-legged in the void, his hands forming an eternal seal. After reaching this step, the Eternal Realm began to undergo the greatest change in its history. The dusky existences that had fused with the light began to surge and condense. In an unimaginable manner, they began to condense into paths, linking the countless worlds in this world together. The originally scattered worlds merged into one, forming an incomparably wondrous network. Once this network was formed, the light radiating from the various worlds began to converge. Instead of spreading out towards the entire Eternal Realm, the light flowed continuously along the paths, constantly shifting between the many worlds and forming an indescribable system of circulation. Just as the old man was explaining, there were hundreds of strange lights, or rather, other mysterious powers passing through the place where they were walking, flowing from one world to another. It's said that these paths are the giant's meridians, blood vessels, and energy circulation pathways. I wonder if that's true. In the end, the old man spoke of a legend that had been circulating within the Eternal Realm for a very long time. When they heard this, the 8 people who just stepped into the Eternal Realm all revealed expressions of shock. This possibility was something they'd never even considered. And if it was true, then the ruler's boldness had probably exceeded the limits of their imaginations. They were all tongue-tied, unsure of what to say. This is all just speculation. We don't even know if it's true or not. Besides, even if it's true, it won't affect us too much. The old man smiled when he saw this. When he'd first heard this legend, he'd also been tongue-tied. It wasn't until later that he discovered that nothing had changed. On the contrary, it actually made his cultivation in this world smoother and more relaxed. Only then did he toss these speculations to the back of his mind. In the end, the middle-aged cultivator sighed and said, "It really won't affect us much, but we're all cultivators of the same level, so why is the difference between us so great?" At this moment, an aura of defeat began to spread among them. "Right? I heard fellow cultivators say that it's easier and faster to cultivate here. Are there any benefits that weren't available before?" The ice-cold woman asked. When they heard this, the others also perked up their ears. No matter how important everything else sounded, it couldn't compare to this question in the end. After all, what cultivators cared about the most was their own cultivation and how much they could benefit from this place. Compared to this, everything else had to be put aside. This is very difficult to describe. Different fellow cultivators will receive different benefits. As for the specifics, you'll have to experience it for yourselves to understand. The old man didn't answer directly. He only smiled and said, when the cultivators heard this, they were slightly dissatisfied. However, since the other party wasn't willing to speak, there was no point in forcing them. On the contrary, it would only erase the good karma they'd built up. As for asking what benefits the other party received, that was impossible. After all, this was the other party's privacy. If the other party took the initiative to speak, there was naturally nothing to worry about. If the other party wasn't willing to speak, it would be too rude to force them. As they spoke, they arrived at another world. In other words, they were at a certain node of the transportation network. The old man arrived and said with a smile, "This world is quite suitable for use, and it suits the indestructible world that fellow Taoists are familiar with. However, our destination isn't this world, so I'm afraid we won't be able to enter this world with you." When they heard this, everyone naturally knew that the old man was going to separate from them. They didn't say anything else and bowed to thank the old man for his guidance. The old man returned the greeting with a smile, then separated from them and continued forward with the two cultivators beside him. When the eight saw this, they sighed. The middle-aged man said, "If I knew this world would change like this, I would have entered a long time ago." What's the point of saying this now? What does the suitable for the eternal world that fellow cultivator mentioned mean? We need to take a good look. The young cultivator smiled. His words piqued the curiosity of the others. They all nodded and smiled. That's how it should be. The eight of them stepped into the node, which was also the world closest to them after they entered the eternal world. In reality, the changes that the old man had described to the eternal world weren't complete. Apart from the various changes that occurred in the void of the eternal world, in reality, every world here had also experienced great changes. In the past, every world here had the appearance of a normal world. At most, there were some differences in appearance. Some were larger, some were smaller. Some were more regular, and some were more irregular. But now, even though looking from afar, the countless heavens and lands still looked exactly the same as before, like numerous stars. Only when one got closer would one discover that the endless heavens and lands in the eternal world were completely different from the past. All the worlds, no matter which one it was, now had a completely different appearance from before. Some were like animals, some were like plants, some were like divine beasts, some were like strange beasts, some were like magic treasures, some were like weapons, and there were even some that were like humans. There were truly all kinds of strange things that were difficult to describe. It was as if the world they had entered at this moment was like a pocket, quietly lying in a corner of this huge traffic network, becoming a node of this huge traffic network, and the place they had entered was the opening of the pocket. Looks like these changes might be related to the benefits of cultivating in the eternal world. Otherwise, no matter how careless we were, we wouldn't have missed these changes. The eight of them actually had the same guess in their hearts. However, the old man had already left earlier, so it was impossible for them to ask him about it, even if they wanted to. Not to mention that the old man had already said that they would have to explore the benefits themselves. Even if they asked the old man again, it would probably be useless. After stepping into the pocket, they discovered that they had walked out of a certain door and stepped into an incomparably beautiful world. The world was round and square, the sky was high, and the ground was wide. The air was extremely fresh, and the air was filled with all sorts of indescribable mysterious lights. They could vaguely sense that there was a strange power floating in the air, filling their surroundings, filling the entire world. Around them was a gathering point of cultivators. At a glance, there were probably hundreds of thousands of cultivators gathered here. What they were doing was very strange. Some were setting up stalls, some were buying things, some were talking loudly, and some were even directly discussing the way. This caused them to wonder if they'd arrived at a market in the mortal world. Looking back at the place they had entered from, they saw that it was a door that was at least 300 meters tall. The door looked rather simple and unadorned. From the door, they could see countless lights condensing into a screen of light. There were faint vortexes spinning on the screen of light. However, they could not see the scene behind the door at all, nor could they see the transportation network that they had come from. This world seems to have opened up everything. The young cultivator murmured at this moment, indescribable shock appearing in his eyes. That's not all. I feel like there's some kind of controlling the power of the entire world, as if there's a ruler in this world. That's right, a ruler. The cold woman was shocked at this moment, but she was no longer as cold as she usually was. Hearing her words, the rest of them were extremely shocked. Vaguely, they had already understood what the biggest change was. Chapter 2062. This time, there was no one else who came to talk to them. In this part of the world, at least in this part of the world that they had seen, everyone was doing their own thing and living a comfortable life. Who would have the mood to pay attention to these rookies who didn't seem to have much to gain from a glance? Is this the difference that fellow Taoist was talking about? It looks like we've missed out on a lot of things in the eternal world. The middle-aged cultivator murmured. There was a hint of regret in his eyes, but more than that, curiosity and shock. They were cultivators on the second level of the path of Tao sovereigns. They were existences that far surpassed supreme monarchs and the cultivators on the first level of the path of Tao sovereigns. It went without saying how strong their sensory abilities were and how deep their understanding of heaven and earth was. There is no need to describe it. After being reminded by someone else, they naturally discovered the abnormalities of this part of the world. They discovered the difference between this part of the world and the world they'd experienced before. In their senses, this part of the world seemed to have gained a new core. A core that was like the ruler of the eternal world. This core controlled all the changes in this part of the world, as well as almost all the laws of this part of the world. This kind of absolute control could only be described as a ruler. They clearly hadn't come here to stare blankly. After discovering the difference in this part of the world, they began to identify the cultivators around them. In the end, they dragged a cultivator over to ask about the situation of this part of the world. They weren't any weaker than the cultivators in this part of the world, so they were naturally valued by others because of their strength. Therefore, after asking a few people, they quickly figured out what was going on in this part of the world. It was just as they'd sensed before. This part of the world truly had an additional ruler. In reality, it wasn't just this part of the world. There were hundreds of thousands of worlds within the eternal world that had rulers. They didn't occupy a large proportion of the worlds in the eternal world, but they were still a force to be reckoned with. The situation within the eternal world had begun to change. The ruler of this part of the world was a cultivator called Fei Wu. Fei Wu was a woman with a merciful heart and a kind heart. This woman had occupied this world thousands of years ago, and according to some mysterious law of this world, she had become the ruler of this world. After that, she opened up the world and opened up the mysteries of this world to any cultivator who stepped into this world. It allowed any cultivator to easily comprehend the mysterious power that existed in this world. It was precisely because of Fei Wu's actions that this place became a well-known public area. Or in other words, it became a gathering place and a trading market among the many worlds around it. Many of the cultivators here had stayed because they liked the atmosphere and the rules of this world. There are no rules to becoming the ruler of a certain world. The middle-aged cultivator sighed after asking around. Becoming a hegemon actually allowed one to define the laws of the world and reveal the profundities contained within the world to the public without any reservations. This meant that becoming a hegemon would definitely allow one to easily obtain the profundities and profundities contained within the world. This was obviously a huge temptation for any cultivator. Even the 8 who had just re-entered the eternal world couldn't resist such temptation. They didn't have much tolerance for it. However, according to the information they heard, becoming a hegemon of a world didn't have a strict requirement in terms of cultivation. But it was still extremely difficult. Otherwise, there wouldn't be so many worlds in the eternal world. There were billions of cultivators who'd entered through the path of becoming a Tao sovereign, yet only a few 100,000 worlds had rulers. The difficulty of becoming a hegemon was that there was no way to find one. Perhaps one could pick up a rock and become the ruler of a world. Perhaps one could destroy the entire world and still gain nothing. There was no way to know what to do. If it was an ordinary level of difficulty, they could still try to find a way to become a hegemon of the world. But there was no way to find a way to do so. Even if they had incomparably firm willpower, they couldn't find a way to become a hegemon. They couldn't find a way to become a hegemon. There have to be some rules, right? For example, how did those hundreds of thousands of hegemons become hegemons? Surely a fellow Taoist has concluded that? The young cultivator asked in the end, unwilling to give up. Of course I have. It's precisely because many fellow Taoists have concluded that there's despair. The cultivator who'd been questioned smiled wryly when he heard this. Could it be that every hegemon's method is different? If that's the case, then this can also be considered a kind of rule. The young cultivator asked curiously. Of course not. If that's the case, how could so many fellow Taoists still be unable to conclude a rule? In reality, according to the summary research, there isn't a single rule that can be applied to the methods of those hegemons. No repetition, leaning towards a certain direction, leaning towards a certain action, leaning toward a certain power. No matter what rule is concluded, it'll be quickly broken. The cultivator's eyes were filled with helplessness, confusion, and even envy. It was clear that he also had the ambition to become a hegemon. In fact, it was possible that he'd played a part in concluding the rule. However, he'd been completely disappointed in the end. Hearing this, the 8 cultivators looked at each other. There was both disappointment and envy in their eyes. Perhaps it's just luck, the woman said with a sigh. Luck? Fellow Taoists who cultivate luck don't feel anything at all. Even if it's really luck, it's luck on a deeper level. The cultivator who'd responded sighed. Luck was indeed a mysterious thing in the eyes of ordinary beings and cultivators. However, when one's cultivation realm reached their level, the originally illusory luck became very ordinary in their eyes. In reality, among the billions of cultivators that Luo Fan had brought to this area, there were at least 8,000, if not 10,000, who cultivated luck. As for the others, they cultivated karma. Fate, on the other hand, had everything upon hearing this. The 8 of them smiled wryly. After this conversation, the cultivator could be considered to be acquainted with the 8 of them. After a round of introductions, the cultivator invited the 8 of them to his cave abode. Through the conversation just now, he'd already learned that the 8 of them had just entered the eternal world and wanted to ask about the situation outside. Although the eternal world was extremely vast, it was still an insignificant part of the second level of the Tao sovereign path. As a cultivator, how could they not be interested in the situation outside? The 8 cultivators had left the eternal world for far too long, so they urgently needed to understand the various aspects of the world. This was what they'd been hoping for. Moreover, in return for a plum, the other party had answered so many of their questions, so it wasn't a big deal for them to resolve their doubts. The cultivator's cave abode was naturally located in this public world. After arriving at the cave abode and discussing Tao for several days, both sides learned a lot. On this day, while they were discussing Tao, the entire world suddenly began to shake violently. Then, a loud voice swept across the entire area. Fei Wu, come out. I've taken a liking to this world. Offer it up now, and you can be spared from death. This voice was extremely rough, and as it roared, it shook the souls of all living beings in this world, making them lose control of themselves. Who is it? Who dares to be so disrespectful to Fairy Fei Wu. The 9 people discussing Tao in the cave abode were extremely angry at this moment. In fact, they weren't the only ones. Almost all the cultivators in this world were furious. For a time, whoosh, 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 figures rushed out of their respective cave abodes. They floated in the sky and scanned the entire world with their senses. They turned the entire world into the tightest security perimeter, making it difficult for any hostile living beings in this world to hide. The cultivators here, apart from those who were born and raised in this world, the rest were cultivators from the second level of the Tao Sovereign Path. Their strength was equivalent to that of a second tribulation expert. Even if there was a gap between such existences, the gap would not be too big. At this moment, the cultivators' senses swept across the area, forming a pressure that was strong enough to crush any second tribulation expert into powder. Haha, you've changed so much already. There are actually both men and women. That rough voice sounded again at this time. At that moment, many of the cultivators saw clearly who was speaking. It was a huge figure that was beyond this world, a figure that looked like an indomitable giant. The figure was a strong man with an unkempt beard, and his entire body emitted an indescribably violent aura. He stood there as if he could pounce and destroy everything and tear everything apart at any time. The strong man held a long rod that looked like a pillar that could support the sky. At this moment, he raised the rod horizontally and pointed it at the entrance of this world. In other words, the entrance that looked like a pocket in this world. How dare you? At this moment, many of the cultivators in this part of the world revealed expressions of indescribable resentment. To them, Fairy Fei Wu's actions were a great kindness to them. Every single one of them had immense respect and admiration for Fei Wu. Some of them even felt extremely grateful towards her. Under such circumstances, how could they tolerate someone insulting Fairy Fei Wu like this? In that instant, one after another mystic arts and surges of power after another flew out of thin air and blasted out towards the outside world. Almost all the cultivators here were at the second tribulation, so it was not difficult for them to cross the world and attack other living beings. At this moment, their divine abilities were not obstructed by the world at all. They easily arrived outside the world and turned into mottled lights that blasted towards the burly man. The strong man laughed out loud. The long rod in his hand that looked like a pillar that could support the sky shook slightly. As the light exploded, all the spells that blasted at him melted like snow under the sun. In the end, he did not even suffer much shock, let alone being injured. How is this possible? Cries of disbelief rang out from the mouths of the cultivators, and they reverberated across the entire world. Why do you have to do this, fellow cultivator? I cultivate here, and you cultivate in another world. We don't interfere with each other. Fellow Taoist, why must you be so overbearing? Just at this moment, a gentle voice leisurely resounded, and it spread through the world. It even traveled outside the world and into the strong man's ears. You're saying it nicely now. This world was mine in the first place. You forcefully took it from me, and now it's my fault? The strong man said angrily. As he spoke, the long rod in his hand had already pierced into this world. Crack, 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 crack. At this moment, extremely horrifying cracking sounds came from all over the world. Countless tiny cracks appeared everywhere, and the entire world began to shake as if it could collapse and be destroyed at any time. Fellow cultivator, you must be joking. Although I became the ruler of this world in a daze, I also know that you have no fate with this world. However, I also know that fellow Taoist has no fate with this world. Even without me, fellow Taoist would not be able to become the ruler of this world, the gentle voice said. As he spoke, a strange ripple swept through the world. All the cracks and tremors were completely healed, and the entire world returned to normal, as if nothing had happened. You're indeed sharp-tongued. I'm a bore, but I can't win against you. However, I'm not reasoning with you right now. Either you transfer this world to me right now, or I will destroy this world right now. Choose one. The burly man roared at this moment. Could it be that fellow Taoist thinks that no one can deal with you after condensing this avatar? At this moment, the gentle voice finally contained a hint of anger. Said, "Of course there are people who can deal with me. However, that person is definitely not you." The burly man laughed loudly at this moment. The long staff in his hand suddenly shook, and a terrifying vibration power instantly burst out from the long staff. With an absolute momentum, it constantly poured into this part of the world, wanting to completely destroy this part of the world. Just at this moment, a slender hand appeared out of thin air and grabbed the rod. Then, with a shake, the rod disappeared. The long rod had already collapsed and turned into a ray of light. In the blink of an eye, it had completely entered the body of the strong man. "You also succeeded?" Seeing this, the brawny man was shocked. His eyes were filled with disbelief as he couldn't help but exclaim, "Just a little bit more. Now I can only slightly condense a part of my body." The gentle voice said again. While speaking, the slender hand had already disappeared without a trace. Bursts of light condensed, and a huge upper body of a woman appeared outside the world, facing the strong man from a distance. This woman's appearance was not too beautiful, but there was a gentle and compassionate realm about her. She was extremely pleasing to the eye, and people who looked at her would feel that their souls were cleansed and become calm. At this moment, this woman's upper body had only condensed between her chest and abdomen, occupying only about 1/3 of her body. Under this, it was full of illusory light, like a pile of smoke gathering under her body, supporting her upper body. At this time, the strong man frowned, and there was a struggle in his eyes. "Although I can't say that the reason for your current achievements is not because of your failure. After all, it has something to do with it. Why do you have to entangle yourself with me just because of a grievance? Why don't you further deepen this power incarnation and reach the state where you can size it at will? At that time, you might be able to use this opportunity to step onto the path of a third-level Tao Master. This is many times better than entangling yourself with me." The gentle woman, who was also known as Fairy Fei Wu, said at this time. Hearing this, the strong man snorted and said, "I misjudged your strength. But just you wait. When I have confidence, I will definitely come back to take back this world." With that, his body shook and turned into endless light, merging into the transportation network inside the eternal world, and gradually disappeared without a trace, as if he had never appeared in the first place. I didn't expect him to succeed so quickly. The gentle woman let out a sigh at this moment. Her figure trembled slightly, and she also turned into a ray of light. She gradually merged into the traffic network and disappeared in the blink of an eye. At this time, in the various worlds, the many cultivators who saw this scene were already slightly stunned. Those just now should be the same type of incarnation that the disciples of the Tao Masters used back then. In the flying world, the young cultivator murmured with some disbelief. It should be. The incarnations of the Tao Masters back then gave off the same feeling as now. However, Fairy Fei Wu's incarnation seems to be slightly inferior in terms of level. It's not as profound, not as agile. At this moment, the owner of the cave mansion was just as shocked as them. In fact, it could be said that he was even more shocked than all of them. I didn't expect it to develop to this point. We really missed too many opportunities when we left back then. The others murmured one by one. Their expressions were filled with regret and shock. At this time, the cold woman could not hide her excitement. The cold woman could not hide her excitement. Chapter 2063. The woman was leaving not because she was tired of the cave abode, but because she had been greatly stimulated by the battle between Fairy Fei Wu and another cultivator. Now, a strong will to fight surged uncontrollably in her heart. She desperately wanted to become an expert like the two of them, and wanted to obtain the divine abilities that the two of them possessed. The eyes of the others lit up at this moment. Clearly, they had been reminded by the woman's performance, and a strong will to fight was also born in their hearts. "I'm leaving too," the young cultivator murmured. Right now, there are only a few 100,000 worlds with a ruler, and there are trillions of worlds without a ruler. There has to be one that suits me, The other cultivators all had strange looks on their faces. They looked at each other and smiled at each other. Without saying anything else, they left the cave abode together and headed for the exit of the world. Originally, it was possible to enter and exit any world in the eternal world at will, but after they had rulers, the methods of entering and exiting the world were naturally different, depending on the ruler's thoughts. For the world occupied by Fairy Fei Wu, the opening of the pocket was the entrance. Apart from that, no other place was a normal entrance. If any cultivator tried to force their way in, it would be disrespectful to Fairy Fei Wu. At that time, even if Fairy Fei Wu didn't do anything, the other cultivators' gazes could kill them. It was precisely because of this that they needed to choose an exit to leave this world. Along the way, they saw a dense crowd of cultivators rushing toward the exit. These cultivators' faces were filled with eagerness and a strong will to fight. It was obvious that their mentality was similar to the 9 of them at a glance. In fact, it wasn't just this world. Similar things were happening in almost all the other worlds. More and more cultivators gained a strong will to fight, and they rushed out of the world from all over the world. They wanted to go to other worlds without rulers and try to become rulers of the world. None of the worlds in the eternal world would reject cultivators. In other words, as long as they had the heart, any cultivator who entered the eternal world from the second layer of the Tao Sovereign Path could step into any world in the eternal world at will. Given how many trillions of worlds there were in the eternal world, no matter how small the chances were, there shouldn't be just a few 100,000 worlds with sovereigns. The reason why only a few 100,000 worlds had rulers, while the other cultivators attached themselves to those worlds and cultivated under the various conditions created by the rulers instead of striving to become the ruler of a particular world, was very simple. In the eyes of ordinary cultivators, there was no need to work hard to become the ruler of a particular world. The difficulty and benefits of becoming a ruler were simply incomparable. There were indeed many benefits to becoming a ruler. It was enough for them to control a part of the world, and from there, they could modify the world according to their own characteristics, allowing the secrets hidden in the world to be revealed to the cultivators to the greatest extent. It would allow the cultivator to obtain the greatest number of hidden treasures in this world. But what else? Apart from this, the cultivators could not see any other benefits. That's right, this kind of benefit was already quite great, enough to make many cultivators scramble for it. However, there was nothing he could do to become the ruler of a world. That was simply too difficult. Among the countless trillions of worlds, there might only be one world that was suitable for a certain cultivator and could accept a certain cultivator as a ruler. If one wanted to discover this world, they naturally had to go to as many worlds as possible and fight to become the ruler of a particular world. If that was all, even if the cultivators found it troublesome, they wouldn't have enough patience and perseverance to explore the worlds one by one. However, to find out whether or not one was a suitable candidate to be the ruler of a particular world, it was impossible to know just by stepping into that world. Instead, one had to go through countless methods to test and try. In the end, when someone else became the ruler of that world, only then would one know that one was not a suitable candidate to be the ruler of that world. As for worlds where no cultivator had ever become a ruler, that was troublesome, because one didn't know if it was because one didn't have the right method, or because that world simply wasn't able to accept one. It was precisely because of this that the cultivators were discouraged and gave up on trying to become the ruler of a particular world. Instead, they attached themselves to the rulers and cultivated in the cultivation environment created by the rulers. However, the current situation was clearly completely different. After becoming a ruler, he was able to condense the embodiment of that mysterious power, and he was able to do the unimaginable things that the disciples of those Tao sovereigns had done. They could not even begin to imagine how much benefit this would bring to their understanding of that mysterious power. Such benefits were enough to suppress all difficulties, and it was enough to make many cultivators willing to waste endless time searching for a world that could accept them as a ruler. The 9 cultivators quickly arrived at the exit of the world. When they arrived, they saw a dense crowd of tens of thousands of cultivators either lining up here or rushing out of this world. All of their expressions were extremely bright, and one could faintly see intense flames burning in their eyes. Seeing this, the 9 of them looked at each other with rather resolute expressions. At this moment, the young cultivator said, "There are simply too many worlds. I think we should choose some methods to search for them. We can't just run around like headless flies." The cultivator that was dragged in by the 8 of them sighed and said, "Methods? Unfortunately, there are no methods at all. Over the past 10,000 years, all the methods that cultivators came up with have been proven to be wrong. They're of no help in becoming a ruler. Perhaps I have a method that will help in this matter." Suddenly, Yi Zichen's eyes lit up. "Suddenly," the cold woman said. Hearing this, the surroundings suddenly fell silent. Whether it was the other 8 cultivators or the many cultivators in the distance who were waiting to leave this world in search of a ruler, they couldn't help but look over from all directions. Clearly, the woman's words caught their attention, and they wanted to know what method she had. Sensing this, the woman frowned and looked in all directions. At this moment, the other cultivators realized what was going on and couldn't help but laugh awkwardly. However, after all, they were all cultivators. They wouldn't deliberately act like they didn't care just because they were embarrassed. At that moment, many cultivators gathered and bowed to the woman, expressing their desire to hear what method she had. In fact, some cultivators even expressed that if the method worked, they were willing to give the woman some compensation. Seeing the other cultivators like this, the woman didn't continue to pester them. After all, she was the one who accidentally said what they cared about the most first. Their current behavior could be said to have given her enough face. At this moment, she said, "Compensation doesn't matter. It's just an idea. I don't even know if it will work. I only hope that if you feel that there are any omissions in my idea, or if there's any room for improvement, you can tell me." Hearing this, the other cultivators were all delighted. One by one, they all declared that there was no problem and urged the woman to quickly speak her mind. The woman didn't waste any more time and continued, "Since there are simply too many worlds, and we don't know which one of them can accept us as a ruler, we can't tell if it's because the method is wrong or the world itself doesn't want to accept us. Then, let's think of a way. It won't take long to enter many worlds at the same time, right?" Her words made all the cultivators present quiet down. Every cultivator's eyes showed a kind of thoughtful light, and some cultivators' eyes even showed an indescribable light of hope after thinking, and their eyes became several times brighter. They were cultivators who came from the second layer of the Tao Master's path. Every one of them could be regarded as a supreme existence who knew everything and was omnipotent. Naturally, they couldn't be like ordinary people and think that it was impossible for an individual to enter different worlds at the same time, as the woman said it. In fact, as soon as the woman said this, they already understood what she meant. "Doppelganger, why did I forget such an easy way?" A cultivator murmured, his expression both excited and regretful. He was excited because this method sounded quite feasible, which meant that he really had a chance to become a ruler of a certain world. However, he was regretful because this method sounded so simple. But as a cultivator on the second layer of the Tao Master's path, he actually didn't remember this method until now. At this moment, the other cultivators' expressions were somewhat similar to this cultivator's, but there was a difference in the intensity of their regret. Immediately, the cultivators bowed to the woman and continuously thanked her for telling them this method that they didn't think of. The cold woman smiled and said, "This is just a small idea. Even if I don't say it, everyone will know what I'm going to do next." Hearing this, everyone couldn't help but feel grateful. At this moment, a cultivator said, "I have a special doppelganger technique that can create 10 billion doppelgangers. Are you interested?" Hearing this, the eyes of all the cultivators lit up. Doppelganger techniques were not a problem for cultivators at their level. Any one of them could create millions of doppelgangers in an instant. However, this didn't mean that there was no technique to doppelganger, and there was no need for doppelganger techniques. After all, for all cultivators, if they didn't focus on doppelgangers, creating 100 million doppelgangers was definitely the limit. Only cultivators who had once regarded cloning as the focus of their cultivation and had once carefully studied cloning techniques would be able to break through this boundary. Now that this cultivator was willing to hand over the cloning technique, the number of clones they could create would increase by 100-fold. It would also increase the number of worlds they could explore by 100-fold. It would also increase their chances of becoming a sovereign by more than 100-fold. It was extremely important to them. Needless to say, how could they not be interested? The woman's eyes lit up. He said, "I'm very interested. I hope fellow Taoist won't be stingy in teaching me." The cultivator who had said that she had a clone technique was an old woman. Her expression was cold, and there was a hint of coldness in her expression. However, her attitude toward the cold woman was overly gentle. Seeing the woman speak like this, the old woman's expression changed. He said, "Fellow Taoist, you're able to tell me your clone's thoughts. Naturally, I won't be stingy with this doppelganger technique." As he spoke, he raised a finger and a ray of light appeared before the woman. The woman was overjoyed and accepted the light. In an instant, an extremely wondrous doppelganger technique appeared in her mind, causing her to reveal a joyful expression. The cold woman bowed and thanked him. What a wondrous doppelganger technique. "Thank you, fellow Taoist, for your generous gift." The old woman smiled faintly and couldn't be bothered with the other cultivators. Her figure flickered as she headed toward the exit of this world. Seeing this, the other cultivators wanted to stop her, but they couldn't find a reason. They could only watch as she disappeared before their eyes. After the old woman disappeared, the other cultivators couldn't help but look at the cold woman with anticipation in their eyes. The cold woman naturally couldn't publicize the doppelganger technique that the old woman had taught them. After all, if the old woman was willing to publicize it, she would have done so earlier. That way, she would be able to gain favors from the other cultivators. Since the old woman didn't do so earlier, it was clear that she didn't want to publicize it. She naturally couldn't overstep her boundaries at that moment. She could only apologetically say to the other cultivators, "This technique is extremely ingenious. Without that fellow Taoist permission, I didn't dare to publicize it. Please forgive me, fellow Taoists." Hearing this, the other cultivators could only sigh and disperse. After all, they couldn't very well do something like forcing themselves to owe a favor to a cultivator. At that moment, the cultivators dispersed and left this world one by one. However, a few minutes later, it was the turn of the 9 cultivators. When they left this world and arrived at the transportation network outside this world, they were all shocked by what they saw. The streets of the Eternal Realm that used to be rather empty were now densely packed with countless cultivators. With just a glance, one could tell that the number of cultivators was at least in the hundreds of trillions. Is this still the eternal world we came from? The young cultivator murmured with shock in his eyes. Looks like I'm not the only one who thought of this method. Other cultivators also thought of this method. The cold woman sighed. She could see that there were countless cultivators on the roads, and they were all clones of a certain cultivator. It could be said that almost every cultivator could find hundreds of millions of cultivators who were almost exactly the same. It was precisely because each of the cultivators had hundreds of millions of clones that the massive transportation network became so lively. In fact, it even gave off a faint feeling of stagnation. That cultivator's cloning method can actually create hundreds of trillions of clones. Suddenly, the cold woman's expression changed, and she looked at a certain place in the void. Her words made the other cultivators unable to help but focus their gazes in the direction she was looking at. They also saw the hundreds of trillions of seemingly identical cultivators rushing in all directions towards the various nodes of the transportation network. That cultivator was none other than the old woman. Her path of cultivation is different from ours, so it's very normal for her to be able to create so many clones. The middle-aged cultivator sighed and said with some envy and relief. Obviously, they could also tell that the old woman was able to create so many clones not only because of her cloning method, but also because her path of cultivation was extremely special. In other words, although the cloning method that the old woman gave to the cold woman could only create 10 billion clones, which was much lower than the number of clones that the old woman could create herself, it was not because the old woman was hiding something. Instead, it was because she did not have a path of cultivation to complement it, so she could only create a cloning method of this level. The cold woman rolled her eyes and said, "Do you think I'll hold a grudge because of this? Aren't you looking down on me too much?" The middle-aged cultivator only smiled awkwardly and did not say anything. In fact, he knew that the cold woman was unlikely to hold a grudge because the old woman was hiding something. However, knowing was knowing. In order to be safe, he still had to say what he said just now. "Come, the principles of this cloning method are quite exquisite. Help me comprehend it." As the woman spoke, she casually pointed with her finger, and rays of light flew toward the other 8 cultivators and were accepted by them. Seeing this, the 8 cultivators' expressions did not change, but they were secretly grateful. They naturally knew that helping them comprehend the cloning method was just an excuse. The woman was clearly using this excuse to teach them the cloning method. However, there was no need to express their gratitude. They only needed to remember it in their hearts. At this moment, they did not waste any more words and began to comprehend the cloning method. As they continued to comprehend the doppelganger art, they could feel how exquisite this doppelganger art was. One by one, they exclaimed in admiration, as expected of a technique created by someone who specializes in the Tao of doppelganger. "It's so exquisite." Chapter 2064. It took more than 100 years for the clones of the cultivators to step into different worlds to gradually stabilize. It didn't mean that the cultivators on the transportation network had returned to their desolate state, but that the network was no longer congested and had become orderly once more. In fact, even after 100 years, there were still countless more cultivators on the densely packed transportation network than before. There were hundreds of millions of cultivators going in and out of a certain place at almost every moment. It was clear that the atmosphere in the eternal world had completely changed because of the battle between the 2 rulers 100 years ago, which couldn't even be considered a real battle. Nowadays, almost all cultivators were trying their best to find a world that could accept them as a ruler. Moreover, every cultivator was working hard to create more avatars to go to other worlds and try out more worlds. In fact, although 100 years had passed, the number of rulers born in the eternal world was only in the single digits. Compared to the number of cultivators who were working hard, it was absolutely insignificant. The ratio between effort and gain was too small. However, compared to becoming a ruler, there was one skill that was developing at an unimaginable speed. At the very least, compared to the past, it had undergone an earth-shattering change. This skill was the doppelganger art. In order to create more doppelgangers, in order to enter more worlds at the same time, and to try out more worlds, almost every living being was working hard to unearth their potential in the doppelganger art. Under such circumstances, with the potential of these billions of cultivators who had cultivated on the second level of the Tao Master's path and were experts of the second tribulation, how much effect could they have? It went without saying. In the past, cultivators who could create more than 1 billion doppelgangers were as rare as phoenix feathers and Chilan horns. But now, as many cultivators researched and unearthed the doppelganger art with all their might. Now, 100 years later, 1 billion doppelgangers could be considered the most basic of configurations. Cultivators who had some potential in the doppelganger art could create billions or even billions of doppelgangers, but that wasn't the peak. Some cultivators who were somewhat related to the Tao of doppelganger could even create billions or trillions of doppelgangers at a whim. In this way, although the eternal world was densely packed with billions of worlds, cultivators had already entered almost every single one of them. In other words, almost every single heaven and earth had a cultivator trying to become the ruler of the world, trying to become an existence like the dancing fairy. It was just that it was too difficult to become the ruler of a world. Furthermore, no one would know if they were truly unsuited for this world before they failed. Thus, they gave up. Naturally, It was not something that could be done in a short period of time. Therefore, even though every cultivator could create hundreds of millions of clones, every cultivator was still at a loss. He couldn't be sure. Each and every one of them was actually suffering. However, this kind of suffering was not without benefits for these cultivators. Of course, there were very few cultivators who were lucky enough to find a sovereign who accepted them as a sovereign, and those who were even luckier were almost negligible. However, in fact, every cultivator was actually cultivating with the help of the special characteristics of the heaven and earth itself. In other words, every single cultivator was in the billions of worlds at the same time. It was just like how they cultivated before they knew about the existence of a sovereign. Even if the efficiency of each cultivator's cultivation in each world wasn't high, when the number of clones was so large. After all, the efficiency had reached an unbelievable level. At the very least, it was far more efficient than their previous cultivation methods. Just like that, time gradually passed. As more and more cultivators entered the eternal world from the eternal world, this method of using clones to enter many worlds to cultivate unknowingly became a common practice. After tens of thousands of years, the cultivators who came later didn't even know that the first cultivators created clones in order to become the rulers of a certain world. They just followed the billions of clones into those worlds to cultivate. From this point of view, it was enough to see how great the benefits of this method of cultivating clones in many worlds were. How could a second tribulation expert, who could cultivate on the Tao Sovereign's path, be less intelligent than others? If it wasn't for the huge benefits, if it wasn't for the huge rewards, how could they completely disregard the reason and do as they were told? Time gradually passed. 10,000 years, 100,000 years, 1,000,000 years, 10 million years. Unknowingly, 300 million years had passed. After 300 million years, the void cities that had been built outside the eternal world and amidst the many strange landscapes had completely disappeared at some point. Now, not only had the cultivators from the eternal world returned to the eternal world to cultivate, even the cultivators from the other landscapes had gathered in large numbers and entered the eternal world to cultivate. Compared to before, the number of cultivators from the second level of the Tao Sovereign's path in the eternal world had now exceeded 30 billion. Only a third of them came from the eternal world. They were the cultivators that Luo Fan had brought out from the second level of the Tao Sovereign's path. The remaining two-thirds, or more than 20 billion cultivators, came from an area occupied by the Tao Sovereign's disciples. In fact, although the Tao Sovereign's disciples had directly divided a large part of the Tao Sovereign's path for them to monopolize, it didn't mean that there were no cultivators who weren't under the Tao Sovereign's disciples. The truth was the opposite. The majority of the cultivators here were still independent cultivators who weren't under the Tao Sovereign's disciples. Putting everything else aside, when the second level of the Tao Sovereign's path was divided, it was impossible for the Tao Sovereign's disciples to completely drive out all the cultivators who didn't belong to the Tao Sovereign's disciples. In comparison, the number of independent cultivators left in the endless landscapes was already extremely high for the Tao Sovereign's disciples. The reason why the independent cultivators didn't have much of a presence was even simpler. It was because the difference in strength between the independent cultivators and the Tao Sovereign's disciples was just too great. They couldn't compete with the Tao Sovereign's disciples at all. These cultivators had always been like the cultivators trapped in the area, moving between the various landscapes. They experienced the mysteries of the landscapes and searched for the treasures and opportunities hidden in them. The pursuits of the Tao Sovereign's disciples were clearly different from those of the independent cultivators. Therefore, their cultivation wasn't affected much, and they were similar to the cultivators trapped in the region. There were all sorts of battles and fortuitous encounters. The difference between the eternal world and the other landscapes was that it almost mimicked the environment of the second level of the Tao Sovereign's path. It was enough for any independent cultivator to use this world to complete the cultivation that the Tao Sovereign's disciples were currently doing. There was no wall in the world that didn't have a crack. There were also no secrets that were truly hidden from outsiders. The abnormalities of the eternal world would naturally spread over the years, allowing more and more cultivators to learn about it and understand how great the opportunities here were. As such, they would naturally choose this place. Currently, only 20 billion cultivators had chosen to enter the eternal world to cultivate. This was already a sign that the independent cultivators had become extremely cautious under the pressure of the Tao Sovereign's disciples. 300 million years wasn't a long period of time for the Second Tribulation experts. But for the cultivators who stepped into the eternal world, it was indescribably long. After all, almost every cultivator who stepped into the eternal world had millions of avatars that entered different worlds to cultivate. Under such circumstances, although they couldn't roughly overlay the time that their avatars experienced, it was still many times longer than normal. Under such a long period of time, these cultivators had unknowingly gotten used to the eternal world. In the end, a large portion of the cultivators had actually treated this place as their home. In the past 300 million years, the number of cultivators that had become rulers was much higher than expected. Now, after 300 million years, the number of cultivators that had become rulers in the eternal world had already exceeded 10 million. These 10 million cultivators were still insignificant compared to the 30 billion cultivators. The probability was so small that it was enough to make people despair. But compared to the hundreds of thousands of rulers back then, this was already an incomparably huge increase. And now, the situation in the eternal world had unknowingly become somewhat similar to the second layer of the Tao Sovereign's path, the rulers. Just like the disciples of the Tao Sovereigns, they looked down on the entire eternal world with a transcendent attitude. They looked down on the cultivators who were tirelessly seeking breakthroughs in the unsightly world, seeking to become rulers. Of course, there were still so many worlds that didn't have rulers, so the resources were still extremely abundant. Therefore, the situation in the eternal world wasn't as lifeless as the situation in the second layer of the Tao Sovereign's path. In the past 300 million years, countless battles had broken out in the eternal world. After all, although the rulers were transcendent like the disciples of the Tao Sovereigns, they didn't have as deep of a connection as the disciples of the Tao Sovereigns. Therefore, the conflicts between them naturally couldn't be resolved. In the end, they erupted and naturally became even more intense. War was unavoidable. This kind of war was grand and vast. Every time it happened, it affected many other worlds, and who knew how many billions of cultivators were involved. At the same time, every war became the motivation for many cultivators to cultivate. After every war, the cultivators' fighting spirit would grow stronger, and they would yearn to become rulers even more. 300 million years was a long time. Even rulers who weren't talented in the first place would reap great benefits. As a result, apart from the few rulers who'd become rulers in the past few tens of thousands of years, almost all of the other rulers had already obtained what they saw as the embodiment of power, but were essentially the embodiment of ideas. There were even those who'd become rulers even earlier who'd tempered the embodiment of their ideas to the point where they could size them at will. Their strength had broken through to the point where they could even shake the eternal world. Among them, the hundreds of thousands of rulers who'd become rulers in the first 10,000 years were clearly at the forefront. The cultivators who'd stood out in the first 10,000 years were the kind of cultivators who were stronger than other cultivators in every aspect. If such cultivators were given enough time to develop, how much would they improve? It went without saying. On this day, Fei Wu, the ruler who'd first let many cultivators know that a ruler could form an embodiment of an idea, suddenly had a sudden impulse. She felt that she'd broken through a strange barrier, and an indescribable joy welled up in her heart. I can already leave the second level of the Tao Sovereign's path, she murmured, and her expression became extremely emotional. As she sensed this, the pocket that looked like a world began to distort slightly. The cultivators cultivating inside were instantly affected by an indescribable power, and they were involuntarily expelled from this world. They appeared in the transportation network outside that world. Then, Fei Wu's idea embodiment appeared outside the pocket. This idea embodiment was naturally different from the one that only had an upper body. Now, her idea embodiment was a complete natural Tao aptitude. It looked exactly the same as her real body. Moreover, this embodiment was extremely solid. It stood there quietly, and no one could even see through its body to see the pocket that looked like a world inside. After this embodiment appeared, an indescribable light was released from its heart. The color of this light couldn't be described with words. One could only know that there was an aura of inclusiveness within it. This kind of inclusiveness seemed to be able to accommodate even the ugliest things in the world. It made one feel extremely warm. This light spread throughout the eternal world and gradually enveloped the entire transportation network inside it. It enveloped an unknown number of trillions of worlds and also an unknown number of cultivators in the void. At this moment, one idea embodiment after another emerged from that world. They floated outside that world and looked at Fei Wu's idea embodiment from afar. These embodiments that had just emerged from the various worlds were strong and weak, solid and illusory. There were men and women, old and young, and they all had different shapes and appearances. However, no matter what their embodiments looked like, their eyes were filled with envy. At this moment, the embodiment of a brawny man wielding a long staff said with a somewhat complicated expression, "You succeeded?" His voice spread to every corner of the eternal world. It was like thunder, and even the void itself trembled slightly. This brawny man was none other than the ruler. He was the ruler who had tried to steal Fei Wu's world back then. Compared to before, this brawny man's idea embodiment was even more solid. The sense of reality was also much stronger. It was obvious that he had improved greatly compared to before. Of course, compared to Fei Wu, his improvement was clearly still a bit lacking. Fei Wu smiled when he saw this. "That's right. I can already feel that I'm able to step into a higher realm." Although they had already guessed this, all the cultivators were still a bit shocked when they heard Fei Wu admit it. Their expressions became even more complicated. There was joy, excitement, and a strong will to fight among them. In that case, this cultivation method is feasible. At this moment, the other woman's consciousness incarnation said. This woman was none other than the only woman among the 8 cultivators back then. She was also the woman who had told the cultivators that cloning methods could increase efficiency. In the past 300 million years, she had still managed to become the ruler of a world thanks to a certain fortuitous encounter. She had even condensed a complete idea embodiment. Compared to Fei Wu and the others, she was only slightly inferior. That's right. I'm certain that this kind of cultivation method is correct. We can indeed use this method to break through the shackles of the 2nd level and step into the 3rd level, Fei Wu said solemnly. Although her tone wasn't passionate, all the cultivators who heard her words became excited. Fei Wu only smiled when she saw the changes in the cultivators' expressions. "Everyone, let's meet again on the 3rd level." As she spoke, her idea embodiment gradually shrank. Not long after, it had shrunk to the size of a normal person. It quietly hovered at the entrance of the pocket world. Immediately after, a figure walked out from the pocket and stood beside the will incarnation. The two of them looked at each other and smiled. Following that, the will incarnation and the true body began to merge together. An extremely powerful light was released from both of them, instantly sweeping through the entire eternal world. It was so bright that even the eyes of the cultivators who were watching her felt a piercing pain. A transcendent aura was released uncontrollably from the figure that was gradually merging. Countless heavenly sounds could be faintly heard in the void. Under the heavenly sounds, there seemed to be terrifying thunder being suppressed. All the cultivators ignored the pain in their eyes and used everything they had to strengthen their eyesight. They wanted to see the changes that were happening to Fei Wu's body. Under their gazes, Fei Wu's figure that had merged with the idea embodiment began to fly upwards. Chapter 2065. Greetings, Ruler. At the center of the eternal world, Fei Wu looked at the figure who was sitting cross-legged in the void and exuded a supreme aura. She bowed respectfully and said. At this moment, Luo Fan slowly opened his eyes, which had not been opened for hundreds of millions of years. He looked at the woman who no longer fit in with the eternal world and the second level of the path of Tao sovereigns. "Why have you come here?" he asked calmly. "I've received a great favor from the ruler, so I have to express my gratitude before I leave. Otherwise, I'll feel uneasy." Fei Wu's eyes were filled with immense gratitude. Earlier, when she had begun to surpass the second level of the path of Tao sovereigns and was about to enter the third level, her senses had instantly surpassed their original limits. She had seen the truth that she had not seen for hundreds of millions of years. In other words, she had finally discovered the ruler hidden in the center of the path of Tao sovereigns, the one who controlled all the changes in the eternal world, and the one who brought them endless opportunities. Luo Fan. That was why she had come here at this time. "There's no need to thank me. I'm just completing my own cultivation. How much you can benefit from it is up to you. It has nothing to do with me," Luo Fan said calmly. He was extremely calm as he looked at the woman in front of him. The truth was just as he said. These cultivators who cultivated in the eternal world had indeed obtained enough benefits. Their cultivations had all improved by quite a bit compared to before. However, he had also made great progress in this process. In particular, someone like Fei Wu, who was the ruler of a world, had provided him with far more help than other cultivators. Perhaps we are indeed of some help to the ruler's cultivation, but it's insignificant to the ruler. The benefits that the ruler has given us are like charcoal in snowy weather. It's like sending charcoal in snowy weather. It can't be compared at all, Fei Wu said. Luo Fan could not be bothered to argue any further. He had already made himself clear. Since the other party did not want to listen, he could only let her be. At this moment, he said calmly, "Up to you." Fei Wu smiled sweetly and bowed to Luo Fan with great gratitude. Then, her figure gradually faded and disappeared in the blink of an eye. She had finally broken into the third level of the Tao Master's path. At this moment, Luo Fan felt that a certain spot of light on his body suddenly became extremely dazzling. It was as if a dim star had turned into a sun in the blink of an eye. With a thought, he understood that the bright spot corresponded to the concept of the fusion of heaven and earth where Fei Wu was. Luo Fan's heart thumped, and a strange smile appeared on his face. "It's just as I thought," he thought. Breaking through to the sovereign realm means that, in a way, this concept is complete. At this moment, within the eternal world, the pocket-like world was completely different from before. A perfect and flawless feeling spread out from the world. This perfect and flawless feeling was very obvious to all living beings, causing the world to feel as if it had become several dozen times brighter. The originally inconspicuous appearance in the void had become outstanding in the blink of an eye. All the cultivators who saw this instantly understood that this part of the world could no longer accept any cultivator as a sovereign. They understood this. They could vaguely sense what the undying world hegemon had been thinking all those years ago. It seems that the eternal world may still exist in the second level for a very, very long time. This kind of understanding appeared in the minds of all the cultivators. However, they did not know. At this time, Luo Fan thought, "What a pity. Although this method is easy, it's still too slow. If I were walking on the right path, this method would be enough." Back then, after he had settled down in the eternal world, he had started to create the situation today. What he did was to change the laws of the eternal world from the very beginning. He constructed the transportation network that existed between the various worlds in the eternal world in a state similar to the primal chaos. And he removed the endless gray existence that existed in the eternal world. In other words, the wisp of the mysteries of chaos had been condensed in one place and reconstructed with the structure of his own body. This caused the originally chaotic worlds to become orderly and the endless power of the world to be connected to one place. He had established a continuously perfected circulation system. It was also because of this arrangement that the eternal world gradually changed form under the circulation of the power of the world. In the end, it took on the appearance of a giant floating in the void. Moreover, this appearance was not meticulously sculpted by him, but rather a naturally condensed appearance. It could be predicted that as time passed and the connection between the world and the world deepened, the appearance of the eternal world would become more and more detailed, and it would become more and more similar to him. In the end, even his worldview of laws might manifest in this indestructible heaven and earth. After that, he had opened up a portion of the various powers in the eternal world, allowing cultivators to have the opportunity to control a part of the world and become the ruler of that part of the world. The advantage of this was that through this opening, he could borrow the wisdom of the numerous cultivators to help him circulate the concept that had fused with the world. He could develop and deepen the usage of that concept to the limit. In this way, when the fused concept was fed back to him, he would naturally be able to grasp the profundities of that concept to an extremely deep level. In the future, those cultivators would be able to use the many mysteries of the concepts they had comprehended after becoming a ruler. Or rather, in their eyes, the mysteries of mysterious power. Although he had some guesses about the matter of ascending to the third level, it was only a guess before it happened. In reality, he wasn't sure. It was because of this mentality that he didn't seem to care about Fei Wu's gratitude. After all, this was indeed more of Fei Wu's fortuitous encounter, and it wasn't his intention. Of course, this situation was clearly much better than what he had originally thought. Entering the third level is already a top priority. Although this place is indescribably exquisite, it's only the second level of the Tao Master's path after all. If I could become a true sage just by cultivating here, those true sages wouldn't need to open up a higher level. Luo Fan looked at the endless world in front of him, and such thoughts flashed through his mind. With such a thought, he began to think about how to deal with the contradiction between the eternal world needing him to oversee it and the need to step into the third level of the Tao Master's path. The idea of having a doppelganger to oversee it was immediately dispelled by him. This was the Tao Master's path. If he could have a doppelganger between two levels, what was the point of dividing the Tao Master's path? Not to mention anything else. If he could really have a doppelganger at different levels, then why would the cultivators on the third level need to risk being captured and imprisoned by the Tao Master's prison to step into the second level? Therefore, he didn't even need to try to know that he could not enter the third level of the Tao Master's path with a doppelganger in the eternal world. Perhaps, once he made this choice, his doppelganger would collapse the moment he broke through to the second level of the Tao Master's path, and he might even be imprisoned by the Tao Master's prison. How can I leave the structure of this part of the world and still be able to maintain its stability and continuously transmit its results to me? Since he couldn't just sit and watch, he would have to think about it. Since he could not oversee it, Luo Fan began to think of another solution. This indestructible world seemed to have stabilized, as if its structure could exist for an eternity. But in fact, this was only because Luo Fan was still here at this time. And his will was here to suppress the backlash of the world itself, to suppress the powerful trend of the eternal world that was heading towards chaos. According to the current situation, if he left the eternal world, then perhaps the eternal world could still maintain this structure for a short period of time. It could still allow a cultivator to become the master of a certain world, and the transportation network that connected the endless worlds would also still exist. Even the external form of the eternal world. It would still maintain his appearance. But that was only for a short period of time. In less than 100 million years, everything would change, and the eternal world would return to the state it was before Luo Fan had modified it. Countless ideas and countless flashes of wisdom constantly flashed in Luo Fan's mind. One method after another appeared, but they were all rejected one after another. In the end, after spending several years and thinking of hundreds of thousands of methods, Wang Chong finally came to a realization. He finally decided on a feasible method, and his eyes suddenly began to shine with a scorching light. As long as those 129,600 worlds become complete, their own perfect structure will be enough to stabilize the entire eternal world. Its complete structure alone is enough to stabilize the entire eternal world. So the eternal world doesn't need my presence to maintain its structure. At this moment, in his eyes, Among the countless trillions of worlds in the eternal world, 129,600 worlds suddenly stood out. The 129,600 worlds were scattered all over the eternal world, and from the outside, they looked like the 129,600 acupoints on the body of a giant that looked like Luo Fan. The structure and shape of these acupoints were extremely intricate and mysterious. It could be said that they were the most crucial core of a born Tao aptitude. For the innate Taoist physique, if any of the 129,600 acupoints had a problem, the innate Taoist physique would collapse. On the other hand, as long as these 129,600 acupoints were stable, then no matter how great the damage suffered by the innate Tao physique, it would be able to recover with the power of these acupoints. After calculating several hundred times and finally discovering that there were no more problems, Luo Fan had already made his decision. "It's you guys." With a faint smile, he instantly spread his perception into the 129,600 worlds and began to choose the cultivators to become the rulers of these worlds. After all, although many of these heavens and earths already had a ruler, there were still many that couldn't find a corresponding ruler. Since there weren't even rulers, it was naturally even more impossible to make these worlds complete. Those cultivators could only rely on opportunities and luck to become the ruler of a certain world. However, for Luo Fan, if he wanted to determine which world a cultivator could become the ruler of, he could do it with just a thought and a sweep of his perception. Therefore, in an instant, he had already determined that the rulers that most of the worlds could accept just happened to have their clones in those worlds. He didn't hesitate anymore and directly mobilized the world, directly granting the authority of those worlds to those cultivators. This change made the cultivators who were originally suffering extremely excited. Cheers rang out from the world. Countless cultivators were envious and jealous. As those cultivators became rulers, they naturally recalled the billions of clones they had split out and sent them into the world. They began to wholeheartedly become the ruler of that world. When the hundreds of millions of cultivators in that world saw that the world had a ruler, they naturally wouldn't stay in that world to do useless work. They naturally left that world and went to other worlds to try to become rulers again. Just like that, a large wave of cultivators had been moved away. As a result, the transportation network between the heavens and earth became congested once again. In the end, under Luo Fan's control, less than 70,000 of the 129,600 worlds found rulers. The remaining 50,000 worlds either didn't have any cultivators entering them, or none of the cultivators that entered them accepted them. If this continues, I'm afraid it will take hundreds of millions of years to gather the rulers of all the worlds. Sensing this situation, Luo Fan frowned deeply. If he had to wait for the cultivators to move naturally and gather in the 50,000 worlds, according to the current efficiency, hundreds of millions of years was already the most optimistic estimate. Then, Luo Fan couldn't help but laugh. Forget it. Since it will take so long to wait for the natural transfer, then let's do something unnatural. It wasn't like he was doing something shameful. Even if other cultivators found out and guessed it, so what? At this moment, he no longer felt conflicted. With a thought, his perception began to sweep across the countless worlds inside the eternal world. He began to sense the more than 30 billion cultivators that came from the second level of the Tao Sovereign Path. More than 50,000 cultivators were chosen out of the 30 billion. No matter how strict the selection criteria were, it was unlikely that he wouldn't be able to select all of them. Therefore, in just a few dozen breaths of time, more than 50,000 cultivators appeared before Luo Fan's eyes. After selecting these cultivators, Luo Fan didn't communicate with them, but directly activated his authority as the ruler of the eternal heaven and earth. With the power of the eternal heaven and earth, he directly transferred their true bodies to a world that could accept them as a ruler, and directly gave them the authority as a ruler. This was an unprecedented change. The cultivators that could sense the change were all bewildered. Some suspicious cultivators were even extremely unwilling to accept this. They directly fled out of the eternal world. "I've become a ruler?" The 50,000 cultivators that had benefited from this were all dumbfounded and somewhat at a loss. After all, for a long time, they had put in a lot of effort and exhausted all their wisdom in order to become a ruler of a certain world. However, they hadn't gained anything in the past hundreds of millions of years. Now, in the blink of an eye, they had actually been accepted by a certain world and directly became a ruler of that world. How could they not be dumbfounded? To be able to do this, it must be the ruler of this phenomenon. Only he has the ability to directly transfer me from that world and give me the status of a ruler. Some of the cultivators' thoughts moved faster, and in the blink of an eye, they had already thought of this. After thinking of this, they also understood that becoming the ruler of this world would definitely be of great benefit to the ruler of that phenomenon. Otherwise, the ruler of that phenomenon wouldn't have done this. More and more cultivators thought of this. In the end, there was an insatiable cultivator who actually wanted to raise conditions and benefits from Luo Fan. Ruler, I can become the ruler of this world, as long as you give me enough benefits. Otherwise, we'll just have to part ways. That cultivator shouted directly. His voice directly spread throughout the entire eternal world, spreading to every part of this world, and was heard by all the cultivators. After all, there were cultivators that cultivated on the second level of the Tao Master Path. Although they behaved like ordinary people in the eternal world, there was no need to say much about the power of their divine abilities. It couldn't be more simple for them to achieve this. That's right. If you want us to become the ruler of this world, we definitely won't do it without enough benefits. Another cultivator was tempted, and at this moment, he shouted loudly at this moment, his voice containing intense greed. These words spread to countless worlds and naturally reached Luo Fan's ears. Hearing this, Luo Fan was slightly stunned. I'm being threatened? The many cultivators who heard these words all had different expressions. Some were curious, some were tempted, some were disdainful, and most of them were gloating, intending to see these cultivators suffer. Their minds have actually been blinded by greed. What a pity for their cultivation. A wise cultivator at this time, at this moment, at this time, he despised these cultivators. Let me see how many of you intend to threaten me. At this time, Luo Fan only faintly sensed these cultivators, did not say anything, nor did he do anything to deal with these cultivators who threatened him. Chapter 2067. P.S. Here's today's update. And, at the same time, pull some votes for Chidian's 515 Fan Festival. Everyone gets 8 votes, and the votes will be rewarded with coins. Please support and praise. The woman gradually disappeared, stepping into the third level of the Tao Sovereign Path. She became another legend in the eternal world and a source of motivation for other cultivators and rulers to cultivate. After sending the woman away, Luo Fan's heart trembled slightly. He suddenly sensed that something was falling from the sky and shooting towards him. The object was mysterious. As it flew through the void, it tore through time and space and tore through countless worlds. In the blink of an eye, it had already passed through countless obstacles and was rapidly approaching him. It looked like it was about to stab into his body. In that instant, Luo Fan instinctively wanted to repel the object. However, at the last moment, he suddenly felt an inexplicably familiar aura contained within the object. It seemed to be the aura of the ice-cold woman he had just sent away. With this aura, it was obvious that the object had a close connection with that woman. It was even possible that the woman had personally sent it over. What on earth is it? As this thought flashed through his mind, he no longer hesitated. He reached out, and the object fell directly into his hand, lying quietly on his palm. It was a stone, a very, very, very ordinary stone. A strand of the ice-cold woman's aura lingered around the stone. This strand of aura was incomparably powerful, constantly evolving all sorts of strange scenes around the stone, causing the stone to appear indescribably illusory. It was as if the stone itself could be considered as a fantasy world. With a thought, Luo Fan casually pointed at the stone. With a soft poof, the wisp of aura wrapped around the stone collapsed. In the blink of an eye, it had already disappeared without a trace. This aura had essentially surpassed that of a second tribulation expert. Normally speaking, this was a cultivator from the eternal world. Not a single cultivator from the eternal world could easily resist this aura. The most likely outcome was that the moment they came into contact with this aura, they would be brought into a subtle and short illusion by the power contained in this wisp of aura. Perhaps this was also the method through which the woman transmitted her message. However, it was obvious that this was only true for ordinary cultivators in the eternal world. To Luo Fan, this strand of aura was nothing more than an ordinary aura. If he wanted to erase it, he could do so at any time. He wanted to obtain the information within it. They could also obtain it at any time, but they didn't have to care about the aura, much less what the owner of the aura was thinking. As the wisp of aura flowed out, the stone finally appeared in front of Luo Fan. It's actually hiding a wisp of chaos mystery. In an instant, Luo Fan's expression changed abruptly. However, he had sensed an existence from the stone that he had never imagined before. It was a mysterious state of chaos. Compared to the wisp of primal chaos mysteries that the eternal heaven and earth had absorbed, this wisp was billions and billions of times smaller. However, the mysteries of the primal chaos were the mysteries of the primal chaos. To Luo Fan, the profoundness of the technique was not diminished in the slightest. To Luo Fan, there were still endless benefits. After discovering this mystery, he finally became interested in the information that the woman had attached to the aura. With a thought, he casually waved his hand. It was as if time was flowing in reverse, and the wisp of the icy woman's aura that he had scattered earlier began to condense again. In the blink of an eye, it appeared once more in front of him. Then he casually pulled. The icy woman's intent that had been attached to the aura was pulled out. He pulled it out, and it appeared directly in his mind. This is something I obtained during a certain adventure. Although it's too deep for me to comprehend, it's difficult for me to comprehend. Even so, just sensing its aura has removed many of the obstacles in my cultivation. That's why I was able to cultivate to perfection in such a short time and break through. Now, I offer this to the ruler as a token of my gratitude. This was the information that the woman had attached to the aura. When he discovered this information, Luo Fan couldn't help but smile bitterly. A treasure like this will probably be useful even if you make it to the 7th or 8th floor, but you're giving it away for this small favor. Should I say that you're rich and overbearing, or that you don't know what's good for you? Right now, the look in his eyes was rather complicated. He naturally couldn't give up on this item. After all, although the mysteries of primal chaos contained within it weren't much, it was enough to bring him great benefits. It was enough to raise his cultivation by quite a bit. Even if he had to fight over a treasure like this, he would still snatch it away. What more when it was directly delivered to his doorstep? However, although he wouldn't give up on this item, he was momentarily hesitant about how he should treat the woman. The kindness he had given to the woman wasn't enough to make up for this item. Although he wasn't the kind of person who would kill himself for taking advantage of others, or feel that he couldn't break through because his heart wasn't clear, he still didn't feel comfortable taking advantage of others too much. Forget it. Why go to the 3rd floor in the future? I'll have the chance to repay her. In the end, he sighed and made his decision. After making this decision, he no longer hesitated. He began to send his consciousness into the stone in his hand and began to carefully sense the mysteries of primal chaos contained within the stone. This mysteries of primal chaos was countless times smaller than the mysteries of primal chaos contained within the eternal world. This was a flaw, but it was also an advantage. There was no need to mention the flaw. The mysteries of primal chaos were so much smaller, so the principles and mysteries within would definitely shrink at the same time. In the end, the benefits he could obtain would definitely be much smaller as well. This, naturally, was a flaw. However, from a certain aspect, this was also an advantage. After all, the principles and mysteries contained within were so much smaller, so the level of not being able to comprehend the state of primal chaos was naturally much smaller. If he wanted to comprehend it, the difficulty would naturally be much lower than the mysteries of primal chaos contained within the eternal world. In other words, the The possibility of him benefiting from this mysteries of primal chaos was much higher than the possibility of him benefiting from the mysteries of primal chaos within the eternal world. This was clearly an advantage. As he continued to sense the stone deeper and deeper, his senses began to gradually approach that mysteries, and he began to gradually sense that supreme existence. It was all-encompassing, and it was even almost impossible to sense. No matter how confident one was in sensing it, one would discover that it was a mistake in the end while he was in a trance. He seemed to have arrived in a misty void right in front of him. Before his eyes, a giant pillar that could support the heavens gradually appeared. Standing in front of that giant pillar, he seemed to have turned into the most insignificant ant. All of this became clearer and clearer. Finally, after an unknown period of time, Luo Fan suddenly came back to his senses. Everything that was originally fuzzy and indistinct instantly became clear. The void had stabilized, and the giant pillar that could support the heavens. It also completely stabilized. At this moment, Luo Fan's ability to think recovered. Looking at the giant pillar in front of him, an indescribable shock appeared in his eyes. This item is the leftover material from the creation of a primal origin spiritual treasure. In an instant, he understood this point. A primal origin spiritual treasure was a supreme, true, divine rank existence. However, this kind of existence itself was definitely made from some kind of material. There would definitely be raw materials. In this way, there would naturally be some leftover material from the creation. Obviously, the stone in front of him and the internal structure of the stone was the most likely situation. This was the leftover material from the creation of a primal origin spiritual treasure, which was also the leftover material of that primal origin spiritual treasure. This kind of leftover material was somewhat similar to the fragments of a primal origin spiritual treasure, and it was also incomplete. It also had some characteristics of a primal origin spiritual treasure. However, compared to the fragments of a primal origin spiritual treasure, this kind of leftover material had some characteristics that the fragments of a primal origin spiritual treasure did not have. This kind of leftover material only contained the mysteries of a true divine rank, but not the mysteries of a primal origin spiritual treasure. The mysteries of a true divine rank might be the mysteries of chaos, or it might be of the same level, such as the mysteries of creation and chaos. It was so mysterious. In terms of level, it was somewhat similar to the mysteries of a primal origin spiritual treasure, but the essence was completely different. The mysteries of a primal origin spiritual treasure. It had already been transformed and reassembled. In the end, it was able to display all kinds of incredible power, displaying all kinds of supernatural powers that were beyond the imagination of any cultivator. It was just like the fragments of a primal origin spiritual treasure that Luo Fan had obtained. Just by injecting a certain amount of power into it, it was already able to stimulate all kinds of incredible power with the help of the fragments, almost destroying the world, but the mysteries of the true divine rank contained in the material were different. This kind of mystery, after a certain amount of transformation, was already somewhat different from the mysteries formed naturally. It had a regularity that the mysteries of the true divine rank did not have, but had not been combined with other mysteries, so it was unable to form a true, complete system. Naturally, it was unable to possess all kinds of mysterious power that the fragments of the spirit treasure had. From the difference between these two existences, it could be seen what the stone in Luo Fan's hand was at this moment. This kind of chaotic and mysterious regularity, this kind of chaotic and mysterious purity, was the manifestation of the materials used to create the primal origin spiritual treasure, and also the clear proof that it was a leftover material of a primal origin spiritual treasure. After understanding that this thing was a leftover material of a primal origin spiritual treasure, Luo Fan was even happier. The mysteries of this leftover material had already been sorted out. Compared to the natural mysteries of chaos, it was much easier to comprehend. In other words, it was much easier. My favor is getting bigger and bigger. Sighing in his heart, he began to carefully comprehend the chaotic mysteries of this giant pillar that seemed to support the heavens. He used his own perception to probe this giant pillar bit by bit, experiencing the bits and pieces of information that seemed to have no rules, but the most profound truths seemed to be compressed within it. As he comprehended this, spots of light started to appear out of thin air in the worldview of the laws that covered the surface of his body. As they flickered rapidly, they started to interact with the other bright spots that originally existed. More and more communication began to take place between them. With this kind of communication, the lights that originally existed on the surface of his body began to change in brightness and darkness. Their orbits also began to change, some big and some small. In a trance, he had already entered a state of enlightenment where there was no one and no me. His worldview was constantly under tremendous impact. In the process of this impact, he was constantly absorbing nutrients, using the mysteries of the concept to absorb all kinds of information from the primal chaos. He promoted its growth, causing it to change almost all the time. This also caused his cultivation realm to constantly rise as he entered this process of enlightenment. The eternal heaven and earth also underwent a corresponding change. Wisps of light began to appear out of thin air within the eternal heaven and earth. The positions where these lights appeared were almost completely random, without any rules. It felt as if they were naturally produced. And the color of these lights. Similarly, they were also random. Any kind of color could appear. Some could be described with words, and some couldn't even be described. Amidst this light, the indestructible seal formed by the hands of the giant figure formed by the indestructible world began to undergo slight adjustments. All sorts of indescribable changes appeared on the indestructible seal, causing it to become more and more exquisite at times, and also extremely crude at other times. Strange fluctuations were produced. Following the changes to the eternal world, the cultivators cultivating within it gradually began to feel the change in the difficulty of their cultivation. Even a ruler couldn't cultivate as smoothly as before. He was like the undying seal of the indestructible heaven and earth giant. Sometimes it was much easier, and sometimes it was much more difficult. These changes were so strange that many cultivators gradually grew curious. In the end, a school of cultivation that specialized in studying these laws was formed. They paid special attention to the laws of these changes, hoping to find the reason behind them. And their ultimate goal was to grasp these laws and achieve the effect of controlling the entire eternal heaven and earth from a different perspective. It was obvious. Given that the eternal heaven and earth's various changes stemmed entirely from Luo Fan's understanding of the mysteries of the primal chaos, this school of cultivation was destined to end in tragedy. Time passed quickly. 1 million years, 2 million years, 3 million years. Before they knew it, 1 billion years had already passed. The changes to the world were a little strange, and the difficulty of cultivation was fluctuating, leaving many cultivators at a loss as to what to do. But no matter what, in the end, the cultivation environment of this eternal heaven and earth was much better than the other phenomena. Thus, for the past 1 billion years, they'd made crucial improvements in this world, and their cultivation had truly reached perfection. The number of cultivators who descended still reached nearly 1 million. Among them, none of the 129,600 key worlds that Luo Fan had originally chosen had been left out. All of them had achieved perfection in their concept incarnations and had broken through and ascended, just as Luo Fan had planned. As these cultivators ascended, the formation formed by the 129,600 domains finally replaced Luo Fan's position and suppressed the entire world. This allowed the eternal heaven and earth to finally break free from Luo Fan suppression and continue to exist in this form for all eternity. Of course, after the 129,600 domains reached perfection, there were many other changes besides this most crucial change. For example, the 129,600 domains had truly become the 129,600 sons of the eternal heaven and earth. As the power of the various worlds circulated, complemented, promoted, and stimulated each other, The light of each domain became tens of thousands of times stronger than before. In the end, it completely suppressed the light of the other domains and became an existence that could be seen clearly even outside the eternal heaven and earth. It was precisely because of this that when the 129,600 domains reached perfection, the concept that had originally concealed the eternal heaven and earth outside the eternal heaven and earth was directly torn apart, allowing the appearance of the eternal heaven and earth to be revealed in the void without any concealment. This allowed any cultivator in the void to see the true appearance of the world at a glance, as well as the eternal heaven and earth seal that the eternal heaven and earth giant was making with its hands. And it was precisely because the true appearance of the world was no longer concealed that the countless cultivators in this area, including the disciples of the Tao Masters, began to become extremely curious about this world. This curiosity caused them to start coming from all directions, continuously pouring into the eternal heaven and earth. In the end, the number of cultivators in the eternal heaven and earth increased from 25 billion to nearly 100 billion. Among them, there were even several 100 million disciples of the Tao Masters who entered the eternal heaven and earth as embodiments of their concepts to explore its secrets. And it was precisely because of this change that the eternal heaven and earth had, to a certain extent, become the core of this entire area. Countless cultivators who wanted to find a certain unique landscape didn't directly search for it, but instead came here to inquire about it from other cultivators. There were also countless cultivators who transferred the resources they obtained from other landscapes to the eternal heaven and earth to cultivate, or to exchange them with other cultivators. This change happened unknowingly, and by the time the disciples of the Tao Masters discovered it, it was already too late to change. It was to the extent that even they themselves seemed to be unable to leave the convenience brought by the eternal heaven and earth, and had truly acknowledged its position as the core of this area. Of course, perhaps the second senior brother could change this situation. However, he didn't seem to have any intention of interfering. As the eternal heaven and earth continued to become more and more important, he acted as if nothing had happened and merely cultivated by himself. Chapter 2068. P.S. Here's today's update, and at the same time, pull some votes for Chidian's 5/15 Fan Festival. Everyone has 8 votes, and the votes will be rewarded with coins. Please support. It's said that this landscape appeared out of thin air billions of years ago. In an extremely ordinary world within the eternal world, several cultivators were conversing. The cultivator who spoke was called Zheng Yi. He was a cultivator who had stepped into the eternal world after the eternal world became the core of this area. The other cultivators who were conversing with him had similar statuses as this cultivator. They were also cultivators who had stepped into the eternal world in recent years. However, they were not cultivators who had been in this area when Luo Fan had stepped into this area with the eternal world. Instead, they were cultivators who had ascended to the second level of the Tao Sovereign's path in recent years. As for why they were able to ascend here instead of being confined to the area, it was obviously because they had some relationship with the Tao Sovereign's disciples. It was even possible that they were members of the forces established by the Tao Sovereign's disciples. This was the only way he could step into this region that was unrestricted. This was to be expected. This area was so vast that even if the Tao Sovereign's disciples wanted to monopolize it, they would not completely exclude other cultivators. Those cultivators who had ascended from the first level could naturally choose a place to stay according to their rules. Otherwise, wouldn't the disciples of the Tao Sovereign's path in the first level have no hope of improving? You believe this? Although I've heard many cultivators say this, based on my understanding of this landscape, this situation is impossible. Another young cultivator with a sallow complexion said disdainfully. Compared to the others, this young cultivator had an air of nobility about him. The divine light in his eyes was filled with a deeply hidden arrogance, as if he didn't care about anything in the world. This sallow-complexioned young man's identity was none other. He was the Tao Sovereign's direct disciple. In the secular world, this kind of identity was like the crown prince of an empire. His nobility was indescribable, even among these cultivators who had some relationship with the Tao sovereign's disciples. This kind of identity could be said to be a crane in a flock of chickens. Perhaps it was because of this identity that he was able to treat everything with such arrogance. How could a phenomenon that has just appeared for billions of years become the core of the second level of the Tao master's path? Do you think the disciples of the other Taoist masters are vegetarians? The yellow-faced youth Jianben said. Another cultivator sighed and said, "That makes sense, but every fellow Taoist has said the same thing, so it can't be baseless, right?" Zheng Yi nodded and said, "That's right. Logically speaking, such a situation shouldn't happen. However, there were hundreds of billions of cultivators here. After all, they couldn't all be people who spread false rumors. Since this theory has such a huge market, the possibility of it being true should be quite high. How can the likes of you fathom the power of Tao Master's disciples? Perhaps other fellow Taoists believe that this was indeed the case, and that this phenomenon had indeed appeared out of thin air billions of years ago. But how do you know that it wasn't the Tao Master's disciples who made you think so?" Jianben said with a calm expression. Looking at him, he seemed to be the only sober person in a drunken stupor. His whole body seemed to be full of vicissitudes and stories. Hearing this, the cultivators were all shocked, and they all came to a sudden realization. That's right. If we think about it from this perspective, all the contradictions have a common answer. The cultivators all had the same idea. At this moment, the way they looked at Jianben had changed a little. They were a little admiring and a little grateful. They admired that he could see the truth of the facts. They were grateful that he told them about this speculation, so that they wouldn't be kept in the dark. Jianben sensed the change in everyone's gazes. Inwardly, he became complacent. However, he was obviously not satisfied. He didn't stop while he was ahead. Instead, he continued. For example, how could someone who isn't the Tao Master's disciple come up with this simulation cultivation method? Just this point alone is enough to confirm that the ruler of this phenomenon must be the Tao Master's disciple. Since he's the Tao Master's disciple, he must have already occupied this area with his own phenomenon. Why would he need to appear out of thin air billions of years ago? So that's how it is. I was almost fooled by those erroneous rumors. Zheng Yi sighed. Jianben's eyes flashed. He said smugly, "Actually, I've already guessed which Tao Master's disciple this is. In the entire universe, only that Tao Master's disciple has this ability." Zheng Yi and the others were slightly shocked. His eyes were filled with astonishment. Is that true? Of course. However, the method he used to transform the phenomenon into this is actually not a secret. There should be many Tao Master's disciples who have mastered this method. If I have mastered a certain phenomenon, I can do it too, Jianben said smugly. His confident performance made the other cultivators exclaim continuously. Some of the bolder ones even asked what method it was and if they could widen their horizons. Ha ha! At this moment, a loud laughter suddenly rang in everyone's ears. Who's there? Jianben and the others turned pale with fright. One by one, they unleashed their power and swept around, shouting loudly. I didn't expect there to be frogs at the bottom of a well at this level. The world is indeed vast and full of wonders. Ha ha! The voice didn't stop because of their reactions and continued to reverberate in their ears. It was as if the whole world was laughing at them loudly, causing Jianben and the others' expressions to turn extremely ugly. Who's playing tricks over there? Come out if you have guts. Jianben shouted. The few of them had sensed their surroundings, but they hadn't sensed anything out of the ordinary. Everything around them seemed so normal, and they couldn't see anything strange at all. They couldn't find a person who was talking around them. Suddenly, Jianben's expression changed. He said, "Ruler?" They came to this world to try to become the ruler of this world. In other words, they had sensed that there was no ruler in this world. Now that they heard a cultivator playing tricks nearby, they could not identify the source of the voice. However, they were completely unable to confirm the source of the voice. In their senses, It seemed that only the ruler of this world could do this. Therefore, the first thing they thought of was that there was already a ruler in this world, but the ruler was hiding and did not let them know. It was only at this moment that his existence was revealed, frogs at the bottom of a well indeed. Except for rulers. There are many who can do such a thing. That voice echoed in their ears again. At this time, they heard clearly that it was the voice of a young boy. At the very least, it sounded like a young boy. Following this voice, they finally locked on to the source of the voice. It was diagonally above them, less than 1,000 feet away from them. At this moment, there was a boy who looked to be about 8 or 9 years old, standing there quietly, staring at them with ridicule in his eyes. Although everyone could see the boy, they couldn't sense him at all. In other words, they couldn't sense him at all. This is power incarnation, Jianbin said with a somewhat dry expression. Following his words, Jianbin and the others also understood what this boy was. For a moment, their expressions became unsightly. This was especially true for Jianbin. As a personal disciple of a Tao master, he was very proud of his identity. He even viewed other cultivators who had nothing to do with the Tao master as ants. Under such circumstances, being suppressed by a cultivator that he had clearly viewed as an ant made him feel even more uncomfortable compared to the others. Sir, you are a ruler, so of course you have the right to mock us. We admit it. At this moment, Jianbin's heart surged with anger. He said this dryly. Hearing this, the boy only chuckled and said, "Not bad, not bad." He said, "Not bad, not bad. This is exactly what I know of the Tao Master's successor." A Tao Master's second disciple originally referred to the Tao Master's personal disciples and the inheritors of the personal disciples. But there were 3,000 Tao Masters in the great Tao Master universe, and each of them had lived for billions of years, so the number of disciples they had was counted in the trillions. In this case, with such an accurate calculation, the number would probably increase to a realm that was beyond the limits of what could be described by numbers. Therefore, in the Tao Master Great World, a Tao Master's second disciple was actually a personal disciple of the Tao Master. Therefore, another definition was naturally extended, and that was a personal disciple of a Tao Master's second disciple. In a broad sense, this kind of disciple was still a Tao Master's second disciple, but according to the Tao Master Great World, he was directly excluded. Therefore, the cultivators in this Tao Master Great World had a special title for the Tao Master's second disciple. Yes, this title was Tao Master's second disciple. Compared to the Tao Master's second disciple, the status of a Tao Master's second disciple was lower. However, it was also extremely noble. Those Tao Master's second disciples were no less arrogant than the Tao Master's second disciple. Moreover, because there was no Tao Master to guide and improve, this arrogance was even stronger, and the feeling it gave people was even worse. At this time, the boy chuckled and said, "You don't seem to agree with what I said." Of course. In the end, Jianbin could not help but feel unhappy and responded, "Well, today I will teach you a lesson. I will let you see how vast the world is." The boy smiled and raised his hand to slowly grab the people in front of him. At this moment, Jianbin and the others had an indescribable look of horror on their faces. Jianbin was a Tao Master's second disciple. His own way of cultivation and the power of his own divine sense were many times stronger than ordinary cultivators. At that moment, countless chains surged out from his body. Combining with the chaotic thoughts he had condensed, they quickly pounced towards the boy's hand that was slowly reaching over. The boy just smiled faintly. As his hand trembled slightly, it evolved thousands of subtle changes. It directly broke the power mixed with ideas, and the hand easily passed through all their defenses. It brazenly came in front of them. After arriving at this place, everyone felt that the palm was getting bigger and bigger, more and more vast. At first, it was just a boy's hand, but in just a few moments, it had become as vast as the world. Each and every one of the palm lines and the undulations on the palm transformed into majestic mountains, rivers, mountains, and hills. It's not that it has become bigger, but that we have become smaller. Suddenly, they realized the reason for this change. For a moment, Their expressions became extremely unsightly. If the hand had become bigger, they could still use the exquisite divine sense of the other party to comfort themselves. They would not immediately realize how big the gap between them and the other party was. But the fact that he had shrunk in midair under the opponent's technique meant that the opponent had completely and utterly surpassed him, easily suppressing all of his power and completely controlling all of his techniques. This was the only possibility that the opponent could easily suppress all of his power and completely control all of his techniques. Now that they understood this, no matter how spirited they could no longer comfort themselves. How can such an existence not be a ruler? This was the same thought that floated through their minds. By the time everything calmed down, they had fallen into an incomparably vast world within the palm. Their pores had become abysses, their flesh and blood cells had become continents, and the lines on the palm were like heavenly moats. They couldn't even see the end of it. An unimaginable power bound them at this moment, making it difficult for them to use their divine abilities. At this moment, it was as if they had completely turned into ordinary people. "Don't tell me this isn't the work of a sovereign lord," Jianbin cried out. His eyes were filled with indignation. Compared to his own situation, he was more concerned about whether or not the other party had lied to him. At that moment, an enormous head appeared above their heads. Just how big was this head? It felt as if it had been placed in the starry sky of the universe. It would have been about the size of a river system. Fortunately, Jianbin and the others were second tribulation experts. Their perception was far stronger than they had imagined. Otherwise, they wouldn't have been able to tell that this was an enormous head. After the head appeared, it suddenly spoke. He opened his mouth abruptly, and boundless rumbling sounds instantly rumbled out. It was as if bolts of lightning had descended from the sky, crashing towards Jianbin and the others. In that instant, all of them felt as if they had become catkins in the wind, unable to control themselves. After a long while, the sound finally subsided. Their thoughts also began to gradually recover, and the rumbling sound began to fade from their memories. As the sound faded, they gradually understood what the other party was saying. "If I were a ruler, I would forcibly establish a connection between you and the heavens and earth. Do you feel that connection now?" These were the words of the ruler. The moment they heard the words clearly, their expressions changed. The power that a ruler could use was through his control over the heavens and earth. He used the heavens and earth itself as a bridge to communicate with a mysterious power. With such a foundation, when the ruler's power was used to its limit, the existence of the heavens and earth would be strengthened to an unimaginable level. Even ordinary people would be able to sense it. But now, they were confident that even a ruler would have to use his power to the peak to force them, who were also on the path to becoming a Tao master. In other words, if he were really a ruler, then they should have been able to sense the existence of the heavens and earth that he was ruling over. They should have even been able to directly obtain the aura of the heavens and earth. Obviously, this situation did not happen. How is this possible? If he's not a ruler, how can he have such incredible power? Jianbin felt as if his world had been turned upside down. He couldn't believe what he was seeing. At that moment, the power that enveloped them trembled slightly. They felt the world spin around them, and their bodies grew larger and larger. Finally, they returned to their original size and returned to their original position. The boy was still floating quietly above them, looking at them as if they were frogs at the bottom of a well. However, they had nothing to say to the boy's gaze. They couldn't even muster the slightest bit of resistance. "You don't even know how I obtained this power from this landscape, and you're trying to guess the truth of this landscape? You just need to master a landscape to make the same changes. How ignorant." The boy laughed coldly. His figure gradually dissipated, and in the blink of an eye, he had disappeared without a trace. Everyone looked at the boy's disappearance, their expressions fluctuating. They looked at each other and saw the shame in each other's eyes. From what the boy had said, it seemed that he had obtained this power from this landscape. In other words, this eternal world. Since that was the case, their original understanding of this landscape probably didn't count at all. And since this understanding didn't count, there are various speculations about this landscape, and the ruler of this landscape were even more worthless. With this kind of background, saying that they were frogs at the bottom of a well was almost an overestimation. Chapter 2069. After the boy left Jianbin and the others, he did not leave this world. Instead, he came to an extremely mysterious place in this world. This was the place where the concept that Luo Fan had fused with was the densest. From a certain point of view, it could even be called the highest place in this world. By the time the boy arrived, there were already more than 10 cultivators present. There were men and women, old and young among these cultivators, and the auras they gave off were not any weaker than the boys. In fact, some of them even seemed to be slightly stronger than the boys. Fellow Taoist Tong, you are much slower this time. Seeing the boy arrive, a dignified old man amongst the dozen or so cultivators said. Hearing this, the boy, fellow Taoist Tong, said indifferently, "Just now, I saw a Tao Venerate pass down another Tao Venerate, so I taught him a lesson and wasted some time." Hearing this, the old man frowned and said, "Fellow, why do you have to do this? Although we have obtained strength comparable to the reincarnation of the Tao Master by relying on this phenomenon, we still can't compare to the other party's powerful background. It's really unwise to complicate matters like this." The other cultivators all nodded as well. Their expressions were filled with dissatisfaction towards the boy. The boy smiled awkwardly and said, "I didn't go too far. It's just that the words of the Tao Master's reincarnation were so ridiculous that I couldn't help myself." You didn't hear what he said. If you had heard it, you might have gone even more overboard than me. At this time, the others were not in the mood to ask questions. Only the old man directly said, "Well, these are just trivial matters. The most important thing now is to complete our plan." The other cultivators heard this. Everyone's expressions became solemn, and an indescribable sense of heaviness lingered among the crowd. This time we must succeed. Otherwise, now that we've been rejected by this world, we'll have to expend a lot of effort to find another world that we can grasp. A woman said with a serious expression. "Don't worry, fellow Taoist Lawn. We will definitely be careful and not waste this world that you have given us," the old man said with a smile. The place where the dozen or so cultivators were gathered was the most special place in this world. This was a place that any cultivator who wanted to become the ruler of a world had to find. As long as the corresponding cultivator could combine himself with the mysterious power that existed in this location, he or she would be able to directly control this part of the world and become the master of this part of the world. From then on, he or she would embark on a path that was close to reaching the heavens. This location was found by the woman called Fellow Taoist Lawn. In other words, this world was originally a world that could accept this woman as its ruler. For this woman to be able to share such a world with other cultivators and bring other cultivators here, what exactly was she planning? It was something worth looking forward to. Then let's begin. This time, we must extract the power from it. The old man said solemnly. When he said this, his body exuded an extremely firm determination, as if even if the world was to be destroyed and everything in the world collapsed, he would not hesitate. It was as if even if the world was destroyed, his will would not waver in the slightest. Hearing this, the other cultivators' faces flashed with incomparably intense light. Everyone released their auras without holding anything back, creating an unimaginable ripple that spread in all directions, stirring up the area. Then, through the connection between the area and the rest of the world, the ripple quickly spread, causing the entire world to tremble inexplicably in the process. There is a ruler in this world. At this moment, Jian Ben and the others turned pale with fright. Although they cultivated in this world mostly for the sake of gaining experience and seeking enlightenment, they also had the intention of trying to become the ruler of this world. Thus, they were very curious about what would happen when a ruler appeared in this world. They had already clearly inquired about the changes that would occur when they became a ruler. At this moment, the changes that occurred in this world, from what they could sense, it was surprisingly somewhat similar to a certain cultivator becoming a ruler. Of course, it was only somewhat similar, but there were still many specific differences. In this instant, the image of that incomparably powerful boy flashed through everyone's minds. They couldn't help but tremble at the thought of that image. I feel like this world is no longer safe. Why don't we leave this world? Zheng Yi suggested. Hearing this, Jian Bin's body trembled. His expression was somewhat ugly, and he seemed to be struggling. After a long while, he gritted his teeth and said, "Fine, we can't afford to play around here. Let's go." As he spoke, he took everyone into the air and flew away from this world. They were about to leave this world and head to another world. It didn't take long for them to arrive at the intersection between the world and the outside world. They would soon be able to step into the network and travel to any other world in the eternal world. In that instant, a layer of hazy fog obscured their senses, making it impossible for them to determine where they were. "What's going on?" Jian Bin almost cried out. He'd never encountered such a scene before. At the very least, he'd never encountered such a scene within the eternal world. For a moment, he couldn't figure out what exactly was going on, nor did he understand how such a thing would affect him. "Let's go." In the end, he was the Tao sovereign's successor. With a loud shout, he immediately rushed in the direction they had been heading. Hearing this, everyone came to a sudden realization and hurriedly followed Jian Bin. They wanted to charge through the barrier of this world and leave this world before any more changes occurred. Unfortunately, there was a huge difference between a world and a normal city. If it were a city in a normal space, as long as you could find the direction, you would be able to walk out of the city even if you couldn't see it. But this world was different. The world itself was a combination of time and space. They were, to a certain extent, unrelated to the space of the outside world. Under such circumstances, any cultivator who observed the path out of the world was actually relying on a higher level of sensory perception. It was a combination of one's own cultivation achievements and one's own worldview. In this way, when their senses were blocked and they couldn't see the path, they were like headless flies. To leave this world, it would take at least 100 times the effort. If there were any changes in between, then the already extremely small chance of leaving would become almost impossible. At this time, the situation in this world was obviously the latter. In other words, the situation was changing at every moment. If it weren't for this, Jian Bin and the others wouldn't have to flee this world. In this way, if they wanted to leave, they naturally couldn't just close their eyes and force their way through. Jian Bin and the others flew for dozens of breaths in the haze. It felt as though they had crossed the entire world, but they were still in the haze. They were still in that world, unable to touch the communication network between that world and the outside world that was originally in front of them. "It seems that we can't leave," Jian Bin sighed and said. Hearing his words, the expressions of the other cultivators turned ugly one by one. "Is there really no other way?" Zheng Yi said with some reluctance. Just the changes here were enough for him to clearly see how strange this world had become. How dangerous. How could he be willing to stay in such a world? There is no other way. Right now, we can only seek self-preservation in this world. Jian Bin sighed. He looked down. The entire world below was imprinted in his eyes. As they looked at everything that was revealed below them, it wasn't much different from when the scene before their eyes had become hazy. In other words, they'd flown for a few tens of breaths of time, and it felt like they'd already traversed a distance of countless trillions of kilometers. It was actually of no help to them in leaving this world. Damn it, what the hell are they doing? What will become of this world? Zheng Yi cursed. I hope it's just an ordinary ruler. Jian Bin sighed and smiled bitterly. Since they couldn't leave this world, they naturally wouldn't stay here any longer. The few of them looked at each other and slowly descended to the ground. When they left, they had traveled for so long. However, in less than a breath's time, they had already returned to their original position. Let's set up some defenses first. I obtained a formation from my master. It should be able to protect us, Jian Bin said with some heartache. As he spoke, he tossed out one translucent stone after another. Every one of these stones was quite extraordinary. Each of them exuded the aura of concepts. Every concept was extremely pure. When the concepts of these stones were combined, they could faintly form an extremely crude space. When these stones fell to the ground, they began to resonate. Wave after wave of concepts flowed between each stone. In a short while, they had already combined together. The stones were shaken off, turning into a dense fog that enveloped all of them. To outsiders, this fog was just an ordinary fog, but to Jian Bin and the others who were enveloped by this fog, there was an invisible space-time within this fog. This invisible space was extremely crude, and the rules and laws within it were incomplete. The size of the space was only a few hundred miles. The entire space was so barren that it was unimaginable. Even a space that a Khanate Grand Luo cultivator could casually open would probably be thousands of times more perfect than this. However, seeing such a space, Zheng Yi and the others were shocked. It was as if the space in front of them was not a crude and dilapidated space, but an incomparably perfect world, as expected of the inheritance of the Tao Master. It can actually use that power so delicately. With this space, we can sit back and relax even if the world is destroyed. Zheng Yi kept praising. Although they did not perform well, they were still cultivators at the second level of the Tao Master's path. Their strength and knowledge were many times stronger than the cultivators at the first level. They were many times stronger. Under such circumstances, the difference between the space-time in front of them and the normal space-time in front of them was obvious at a glance. This space, how could it be an ordinary space? They could only feel that the mysterious power they were pursuing filled their senses. That kind of subtle use of mysterious power was something they could not even dream of. Although it was only a broken space-time, they felt absolutely safe here, as if they were under the protection of a Tao Master. Just now, Zheng Yi said that they could sit back and relax even if the world was destroyed. It was not a compliment to the inheritance of the Tao Master, but he really felt so. He really felt that this place had a sense of security that would not be affected even if the world was destroyed. Jian Bin smiled bitterly at this time. Although it is safe, it also costs a lot. With my accumulation, if I want to use this method again, I will need to accumulate for another 1,000,000,000 years. Hearing this, the others hurriedly persuaded him, saying that although it would take a long time, it was worth it. Although Jian Bin was heartbroken, he knew the importance of the matter. Naturally, he knew that the most important thing at this time was his life. Otherwise, he would not have used this method so decisively just now. Therefore, he only felt depressed for a moment before recovering. He began to guess what had happened with the others. While Jian Bin and the others were using their accumulation to protect themselves, at the highest point of this space, the cultivators were already in great danger. At this moment, a storm was brewing in this self-contained region. The originally peaceful scene had completely disappeared. What replaced it was an absolute violence, a violence that wanted to destroy and kill everything in its path. The concept of this world was the concept of peace. Originally, this concept was not very violent. Even in this core area of the concept, it was only spread out. Any cultivator who came here would naturally be affected by the aura of this concept. But now, when the cultivators were taking action, this concept could no longer maintain its normal form. It broke away from its original formless state and turned into endless smoke, displaying all kinds of unimaginable forms, and pounced towards the cultivators. As expected of that kind of power, even if it is only a mild type, once touched, it will erupt with power that can destroy heaven and earth. The old man said with an extremely serious expression at this time, "Now is not the time to admire it. If we can't resist this power, we may all be swallowed and assimilated by it." The boy shouted loudly. His voice was filled with great dissatisfaction. "Not necessarily. Maybe we will just be expelled, just like the previous times." Just like the previous times. Fellow Taoist Lon bitterly smiled. "Stop talking nonsense. Hurry up and draw it." Another cultivator shouted at this time. Hearing this, the few of them did not speak anymore, and their expressions became extremely serious. Their respective powers came out of their bodies, condensed into rays of light, and began to weave in the void. These rays of light were heterogeneous concepts. They were also the mysterious power in the eyes of these cultivators. Compared with the cultivators on the second level of the town master's path, the number of such ideas was much greater. Moreover, the combination of different ideas was quite methodical, unlike the random jumble of ideas of ordinary cultivators. Just from the appearance of these concepts, each of these people had already walked ahead of the majority of the second-level cultivators. It could be said that each of them was already a step away from breaking through the second level and stepping into the third level. These heterogeneous concepts in the void quickly weaved into incomparably huge, invisible chains and began to spread wildly towards the entire area filled with the concept of flatness. With a rustling sound, they extended for hundreds of millions of miles and directly entangled the endless smoke formed by the concept of flatness. Rise! After locking the concept of flatness, the chains suddenly condensed and then madly contracted. At this moment, the entire world began to shake violently. The earth began to crack, the mountains began to collapse, the rivers began to flow backwards, and the world began to flip. Everything seemed to begin at this time, as if the end of the world had begun to appear at this time. At the same time, the dozen or so cultivators all suffered unimaginably terrifying pressure, their bodies constantly trembling, their faces incomparably pale, and cold sweat frantically poured out. As the power surged, it even tore their bodies apart, causing cracks to appear on them one after another. However, what seeped out of these cracks was not blood, but wisps of condensed concept that had turned into chains. At this moment, Jian Ben, who had set up a protective formation somewhere in the world, murmured with a shocked expression. At this time, everyone else also looked at everything in front of them with incomparable shock, sensing the scene of the end of the world being produced by that heaven and earth. What the hell are they doing? Could it be that they are not afraid of the ruler of this phenomenon? A cultivator murmured, his eyes filled with disbelief. Suddenly, Jian Ben murmured, "Perhaps what they're doing is what the ruler is happy to see happen."